In the 4th century BC, during the era later known as the Greek Golden Age, one of the key events was a brutal civil war within the Persian Empire. The main participant was a prince named Cyrus the Younger, who, having lost familial ties and his royal rights, decided to fight for power, armed with all the resources at his disposal. He aimed to strengthen his position and seize the Persian throne, relying on the support of mercenaries and allies. In the hope of securing reliable backing, Cyrus assembled a powerful army, which included a significant number of Greek soldiers, Hellenes, ready to fight for his cause. Among these fighters was the famous Greek writer, soldier, and adventurer Xenophon, who later described this military expedition in his renowned work called Anabasis. This united force of Greeks, with all their determination, launched a fierce assault on the enemy. Their army faced the Persian forces in a decisive battle near the city of Cunaxa, located on the banks of the Euphrates River. The Greek force, strong and heavily armed, fought tirelessly to secure victory. They succeeded in defeating the Persian army, marking a significant achievement for those who hired them. However, after the bloody battle, when the dust settled and passions cooled, tragedy struck the Greeks. Cyrus the Younger was killed, most likely shot by one of the young common soldiers, an event that came as a sudden and devastating blow to all. The prince's claim to the Persian throne was lost forever, and the war seemed to halt along with his death. News of Cyrus's death was crushing for the Greek warriors. Their victorious advance, long march, and all their efforts and resources spent in the fight proved to be in vain. The main commander of the army was also killed in the battle, and all senior generals were taken captive. A group of Greeks found themselves leaderless and stranded in a remote foreign land, deprived of hope for a quick return home. They now needed to find a way back to Greece, aware that the long and difficult journey still lay ahead. They understood that their only chance was to reach the Black Sea, located to the west, with a route crossing vast, uninhabited deserts stretching across modern-day Iraq. The situation was becoming critical. Supplies of provisions and water were running out, and the enemy, the Persian army, was approaching to pursue and continue to overpower them. In this desperate situation, in haste and full of uncertainty, they selected several leaders, among whom was Xenophon himself. He called on his comrades to leave behind all unnecessary possessions and to temporarily abandon excess baggage in order to lighten the load and outrun their pursuers. Together, they began moving across ancient deserts as well as fertile river valleys, rich with date palms and greenery. Their route followed the course of the Tigris River northward, exactly where their goal and instinct for survival pointed. Suddenly, during this dangerous and exhausting escape, they encountered an unusual discovery that halted their progress and made them pause. It was the ruins of an ancient city, completely abandoned and filled with the shattered remnants of giant structures that had long lost their purpose. This city was much larger and more impressive than those Xenophon had seen in his homeland Greece or nearby lands. Later, describing this remarkable find in his notes, he called it the mysterious megacity. The Greeks continued their journey unopposed and reached the Tigris River. There, before them, lay an abandoned city enclosed by a massive fortress wall. This wall was striking in its solidity, about 25 feet wide, 100 feet tall, and extending approximately 11 kilometers. It was built from clay bricks laid on a sturdy stone foundation, about 6 meters high. In close proximity to this settlement stood a stone pyramid, slightly less than a plethron in width and twice that height. At the top of the pyramid, they noticed many barbarians fleeing from nearby villages and hamlets, apparently seeking shelter or moving in search of a safe refuge. But Xenophon had neither the time nor the opportunity to study the ruins in detail. Enemies, the Persians pursuing them, were already very close, and every minute was priceless. Realizing the danger, he again raised his voice and led his men forward, continuing along the river to the north, hoping to find safety and an opportunity to continue their journey home. Just a day or two later, the Greeks came upon new ruins that proved even more imposing and mysterious. These ancient structures were surrounded by a vast circle of destroyed walls, as if holding within them memories of great times. The travelers traveled about 34 kilometers to reach this abandoned site, which had long lost its former brilliance and grandeur. Before them stood a huge fortress, now in ruins, with a foundation made of smoothly polished stones filled with many shells, giving it a distinctive ornament and texture. The dimensions of this foundation were impressive, about 15 meters in width and 17 meters high. On this foundation was built a massive brick wall, approximately 15 meters wide and 30 meters high, encircling the ancient structure.
Its circumference was roughly 30 kilometers.
All this spoke to the grandeur of the original plan and the scale of construction works from a bygone era. However, despite the grandeur of what he had seen, they had no time to linger. Pressing onward left little chance for stopping. Still, despite the rush, the sight of these lonely, crumbling ruins made a deep and unforgettable impression on Xenophon. Over the course of several days, he increasingly immersed himself in questions about the origin of these mysterious cities, questioning locals about who might have built such majestic and complex structures in the heart of the desert. But none of those he interviewed could provide a satisfactory answer. It was as if this entire ancient civilization had been forgotten, and the names of its creators lost to time.
People said that no one knew the names of the magnificent cities being discussed.
Some supposed they were built by the Medes, an ancient people long vanished from the earth. Others insisted that these lands had once been inhabited by gods, believing that one day these lands had been the dwelling places of deities. There were also those who spoke of ancient divine forces that unleashed fire and thunder upon these cities, destroying all life within their walls. Modern historians believe that these mysterious cities had their own names. It is generally thought that Xenophon, living at the end of the 5th century BC, was the first European to discover these ruins and record information about them.
These cities were called Nimrud and Nineveh.
When Xenophon encountered these ancient ruins nearly 2,500 years ago, the first stone of the Parthenon in Athens had been laid only 50 years earlier. The Colosseum in Rome was still to be built. Its construction was planned about 500 years into the future, while the city of Nineveh already appeared before observers as an ancient city with ruins over 200 years old. This magnificent city once prospered, transforming into a mighty capital where hundreds of thousands of people lived. It was also the birthplace of many works of art and architectural masterpieces, which were later recognized as ancient treasures. But, as with everything in history, this splendor suddenly vanished, dissolving into dust.
Ultimately, Xenophon and his companions returned to Greece, leaving behind only testimonies of their journey.
Looking out over the desert, covered with sand, the grassy shoots pushing up through crumbling brick debris, the wind tousling his hair and tugging at his clothing, at this moment, Xenophon was probably overwhelmed by questions that haunted him to his very core. Who were these people? Who built these colossal cities in the ruthless desert? How could such a vast metropolis disappear completely if once there were so many inhabitants here that it was hard to even count them?
What happened to them?
In this story, I would like to focus on one of the most astonishing ancient civilizations known today as the Assyrian Empire. I intend to explore in detail how the Assyrians, relying on the wealth and technology of the Bronze Age, created a magnificent empire that lasted for centuries. In my work, I will try to show how they expanded and strengthened themselves, potentially becoming the first military superpower in human history. Equally important, I will discuss how the Assyrians contributed to an unprecedented flourishing of art, culture, science, and education. Finally, I will recount the events that led to their ultimate downfall, which was so sudden and catastrophic that it forever changed the course of history for this ancient civilization. In this harsh and barren land, known today as Mesopotamia, lie vast plains representing fertile, though often arid, territories where the fate of great states was shaped.
For countless millions of years, these lands were nourished by moisture and fertility, sustained by two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates.
These majestic waters originate in high mountains and, full of strength, flow across the earth's surface, carrying rich silt that generously covers the soil, creating ideal conditions for the development of life. If we could one day soar high above the ground and look down from above, we would see these rivers like bright green lines winding across expansive dusty plains, like living arteries nourishing the land with life. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers form one of the most fertile and productive branches of the so-called Fertile Crescent, a unique geographical formation.
This crescent stretches from the dense marshlands of southern Iraq in the south, gradually transitioning into silty river basins, then extending westward to reach the damp shores of Syria.
It runs north through the mountainous regions of Lebanon, along the Mediterranean coast of modern-day Israel, and all the way to Egypt. Where the Nile, the world's longest river, waters its broad and fertile deltas, surrounding lands rise into high, dangerous mountains on the northern and eastern borders. This vital region for humanity, the Fertile Crescent, acts like a reliable shield protecting its lands from harsh natural conditions. Its vast expanse is bounded on the west by the Mediterranean Sea and on the south by the impassable deserts of Arabia, like ancient barriers stretched across the landscape. This corridor became the cradle of some of the earliest great societies in history, the birthplace of the first civilization. Today, the Assyrian Empire may seem a distant memory, faded into the darkness of the past, yet for its inhabitants of that time, this world was oriented towards the depths of the ages, filled with a sense of antiquity. The very first settlements in this region, such as Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, are aged between 12 and 9,000 years, representing some of the earliest evidence that humans began to unite into large communities shortly after the end of the last ice age.
The Assyrians possessed profound knowledge of their distant past, cultural heritage, and historical roots.
Since the Sumerians invented writing around 3200 BC, they have passed down their knowledge from generation to generation. It is difficult to gauge the full power of this oral and written heritage. It served as a vital link between people, allowing them to preserve information about the past and transmit it to future generations. They honored the memory of great kings from the Sumerian era, perceiving them as semi-mythical heroes whose deeds embodied strength and wisdom. Their legends mention Gilgamesh, a legendary hero who fought monsters and embarked on quests for the secrets of eternal life. They also told stories of Sargon the Great, whose image, according to later Assyrians, lived nearly 2,000 years ago. For the Assyrians, his name was somewhat like Julius Caesar to us, a symbol of an era about which only a few details remain. But despite the passing centuries, his name was still alive in oral tradition, and his stories continued to inspire. The Assyrians created works such as the Middle Assyrian text Sargon, King of Battle, in which they celebrated the hero and his exploits. According to legend, while Sargon ruled on earth, he was accompanied by 12 chosen heroes, and his army traveled through the fir forest, conquered the Cedar Mountain range, and in battle used lightning wielded by their own god to defeat their enemies. Like the Sumerians, the Assyrians did not overlook the forgotten ruins of ancient cities on their land and built legends based on them. They believed that a great flood once covered the entire world and that fragments of destroyed stone structures serve as evidence of this terrible and impassable catastrophe. The remnants of brick buildings preserved memories of that tragic era, reminding people of past destructions. It is important to remember that the Assyrians, despite the revival of civilization, did not see themselves as a tribe emerging at the dawn of human history. They retained pride in their ancient roots and rich cultural heritage, which gave rise to the entire subsequent history of their people. They are considered an educated, highly developed people with a rich and profound heritage that has taken shape over many centuries. It is precisely because of this centuries-old cultural experience that they achieved significant progress for humanity, expanding their horizons across various fields. After the destruction of the Sumerian Empire and the collapse of its centralized power, the Akkadian language became the most widespread and universally used in the region, replacing Sumerian, which continued to be an important part of the historical legacy for a long time. At the same time, the cities that once formed part of the Sumerian civilization gradually separated from each other, transforming into independent and sovereign states. They were located in an area called D, in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where each developed according to its own scenario.
Part 6 of 65.
Each of these cities had its own rulers, its own army, and a patron deity to whom religious rituals and cult structures were dedicated. It has already been noted earlier that in the early centuries of their history, the Akkadians played a more secondary role relative to the Sumerian city-states and their legacy. However, with the decline of Sumerian civilization, the situation changed dramatically. Akkadian cities, especially in the north, began to gain independence and develop along their own paths, transforming into autonomous centers of culture, economy, and military strength. One such city was Ashur. It was founded, apparently, in the 20th century BCE, during the height of Sumerian civilization, on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. Located roughly midway between the modern cities of Tikrit and Mosul, it soon became an important hub for trade and crafts. Initially, the inhabitants of the small settlement, living in tents and simple houses made of river clay and thatched with reeds, were engaged, according to archaeological data, in agriculture and crafts. The dusty streets of the then small city still carried the scent of livestock, harmoniously combined with the smoke rising from primitive ovens and campfires. The sounds of people's voices, the noise of wooden debris, and the rustling of date palm leaves created an atmosphere of lively, constantly bustling life. At that time, the first irrigation channels for fields were likely being constructed, allowing the expansion of agricultural lands and improving harvests. In the early stages of its history, Ashur was a modest settlement, and it was difficult to predict that over time it would become a powerful city-state, leaving a rich legacy for future generations. However, already during the Sumerian era, due to its strategic location and natural advantages, the city began to develop rapidly and strengthen. The Tigris River, meandering around the city, provided a reliable defense on the north and east sides. Builders of Ashur, understanding the importance of natural conditions, eventually constructed thick and formidable fortification walls, transforming the city into a true fortress capable of resisting external threats. The rivers of Mesopotamia played a crucial role in the development of the region. They not only supplied water for drinking and irrigation but also became vital transportation arteries. Barges and boats, guided by oarsmen, navigated the dark waters of the rivers. They transported wheat, barley, copper, tin, as well as precious woods and stones from northern territories. Ashur quickly gained the reputation of a lively trading center, and archaeological findings indicate that by the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE, many of its dwellings had been transformed into spacious and comfortable palaces. Wealthy families, whose riches included jewelry and precious metals, built cellars and hidden storerooms to safeguard their treasures. Part 7 of 65. Gold and bronze artifacts, inlaid with semi-precious stones such as carnelian, agate, and lapis lazuli, were found. Excavations also revealed numerous libraries and archives with clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing, confirming once again the high level of culture and wealth of the city. All this testified to the material prosperity of its inhabitants, capable of making generous donations to the needs of religious temples and cult institutions, connecting their fate with the spiritual and cultural life of the region. In Mesopotamia, at least 30 temples are estimated to have been built, each dedicated to one or several gods worshipped by all the residents of these cities without exception. In the halls and on the streets of magnificent small towns, worship occupied a central place in society's life. People revered many deities, each performing specific functions and occupying a place in the religious pantheon. Among them were powerful and revered gods such as the sun god Shamash, the moon god Sin, the storm god Adad, Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, and the supreme ruler of all gods, Enlil. Imagine, during the hot season, amidst the noisy streets, exciting incantations and exclamations could be heard emanating from the doors of spacious temple buildings. Priests of various deities diligently tried to attract the attention of the gathering crowd, ringing bells and creating an atmosphere of interest and reverence. The sound of drums and the solemn singing of hymns filled the atmosphere with majesty and power. On some days, funeral processions would pass through city streets, singing ancient poems and religious hymns, including the sacred hymn dedicated to the Babylonian god Marduk, which has survived to our days. In this divine residence, special emphasis was placed on ensuring that a person leaving this world in glory and dignity could leave behind a bright image, like the flickering of copper. In such cases, it was said that his soul should shine as brightly as the metal mildly put copper. His son could grant him new life, achieving eternal continuation of existence. The concept of divine mercy was that Marduk, the highest of all celestial gods, promised to provide a residence of happiness and peace for our worthy individual. Temples not only offered prayers but also provided aid to those seeking solace for the soul and relief from suffering. For example, if you found yourself in the temple of the goddess Ishtar with illness or disease, you might hear a prayer recited by one of the priests. He would call for connection with the heavens, because this helps a person detach from earthly worries and suffering. In the case of a brave warrior, always celebrated for strength and courage but suddenly losing his power and lying in pain, one could imagine the celestial Ishtar, goddess who has long cared for people in war, descending from her mountain, a sacred and divine place not meant for humans, and rushing to his bedside. In those times, like many other major cities in Mesopotamia, Ashur began to worship its own god, which meant that the city gained true divine patronage in the most literal sense of the word. In the religious systems of the region, gods and cities were inextricably linked, their fates were intertwined within a unified world of beliefs and cults. Each deity fulfilled various functions, similar to our modern understanding. Their calling was necessary either to protect the city from evil spirits or to ward off dark forces. Every major city had its own patron, a god believed to dwell in the highest part of the city's temple, often represented by a statue or likeness. It was akin to a divine talisman, guarding the city. When a traveler or merchant moved from one city to another, it was customary to leave offerings in honor of the local god, as a sign of respect and blessing. If two cities clashed or went to war, it was believed that their gods fought and waged their battles in the heavens just as fiercely as their warriors did on the ground. The more prosperous a city, the more it was believed that its deity possessed power and strength. At the time when Ashur began to play a special role in religion, the inhabitants of the city, in recognition of its might, decided to name their chief god after it. Thus, the god Ashur was born. Grand and magnificent temple complexes were constructed in his honor, reflecting the wealth and spiritual significance of the city. Over time, the worship of Ashur became a central element of religious life, and his cult spread widely among the population. His image was supplemented with new symbols, and the iconography became brighter and more vivid. He was depicted as a man in an ornate robe wearing a crown, holding a bow in his hand, a weapon characteristic of hunters and warriors. His image was often placed at the center of a winged disc, from where he gazed upon the world and the golden city he governed. As the cult of Ashur gained popularity, the long-standing and respected position of Enlil, the king of the gods who had ruled for millennia, was threatened. In subsequent centuries, the god Ashur even came to rule over familial relations, having under his authority divine consorts and offspring, his wife, the goddess Nin, as well as sons Ninu and Zababa. From then on, the supreme god for the inhabitants of this city was indeed Ashur, not Enlil, and this status became so firmly established that it was almost beyond doubt. The inhabitants of the ancient city of Ashur soon gained wide fame under the name Ashuriya, although today they are commonly known as Assyrians, a designation used by many other prominent cities of the region that played an important role in the history of ancient Mesopotamia. In the subsequent centuries, these peoples repeatedly sought to establish their own independent state, creating sovereign kingdoms that sometimes succeeded in expanding their territories. At the end of the 10th century BCE, a mighty king named Shamshi-Adad sat on the throne of Ashur. He became a conqueror, expanding his territory beyond his native city, which brought Ashur immense wealth and power. During his reign, the inhabitants of the city not only strengthened their authority but also built magnificent structures. Among them, the royal palace stood out, awe-inspiring with its luxury, and the temple of the god Ashur was decorated with a well-designed and majestic ziggurat, a step pyramid that became one of the symbols of the city's status and strength in the Bronze Age. This flourishing of the Assyrian state was impressive, however, it was soon challenged by a formidable external force, Babylon. The powerful southern city, led by the renowned King Hammurabi, began to pursue expansionist policies and claimed dominion over neighboring lands.
As a result, the fate of the Ashurite people was filled with dramatic events. For many centuries, they fought for their independence but constantly faced more threatening and stronger empires that stood in their way.
Throughout the second millennium BCE, the Assyrians alternated between being part of the Babylonian realm and belonging to the Mitanni or Hittite empires, remaining under their control for about 100 years. However, even in subjugation, they never lost their own identity and, whenever possible, sought to regain independence. During this period, Assyrian culture experienced its greatest flourishing. Many archival records from that era have been preserved, among which the epic poem known today as the Epic of Tukulti-Ninurta is particularly famous. It celebrates the military victories of the Assyrians in the south and glorifies the image of an ideal Assyrian king. The poem vividly captures the warrior spirit and fierce temperament of the people. The Assyrians fought fearlessly, often not even wearing armor, removing breastplates and outer garments, braiding their hair, and polishing their weapons to prepare for battle. In these scenes, they danced with sharp blades in their hands, fighting each other as if lions on a hunt. The battle was a whirlwind, with dust and flames swirling like a frantic dance, while death seemed inevitable, as insatiable as thirst, quenched only by the blood of the enemy. When the second millennium BCE came to an end around 1200 to 1150 BCE, the Assyrians faced an unprecedented catastrophe on a grand scale. This period is known in history as the fall of the Bronze Age, an event whose causes are still not fully understood. At that time, a wave of destruction struck the eastern Mediterranean, originating from mysterious forces known as the Sea Peoples. These rebellious tribes land on the region's coasts, and their advance was accompanied by chaos, destroying cities one after another. At the same time, such a destructive storm could have completely wiped out entire civilizations, erased many settlements from the face of the earth, and left only ruins on the map. However, despite this catastrophe, two great states managed to preserve their strength and continue their existence. One of them was Egypt. During these terrible events, the Egyptians were able to stop the Sea People's armies in a daring ambush at the Nile Delta's mouth, miraculously maintaining their statehood and sovereignty. At the same time, the Assyrians faced their own challenging trials, but their state managed to recover and proceed on its path despite difficult conditions. Thus ended one of the most dramatic periods in the history of this region. Despite all the trials, Assyria retained its core characteristics and persisted, rejecting many of its traditional values that had previously supported it. After a series of recent military conquests and expansions in the previous centuries, the Assyrian state limited itself to holding its borders, focusing only on territories necessary to maintain established trade routes. This orderly retreat to its original borders allowed it to concentrate on economic development and internal stability, while preserving its identity, and old grand ambitions for large-scale conquests were abandoned. Nevertheless, when the waves of war and conflict subsided, serious internal and external problems reappeared before Assyria. According to the Roman historian Gorostraio, by the end of the 10th century BC, the Assyrian state found itself in a deep crisis. An economic collapse became almost inevitable, and it was already clear that its consequences were very serious. Assyria lost all its lands west of the Tigris River, crucial regions that, essentially, were lost to enemies. Particularly devastating was the fact that trade routes passing through mountain passes and highlands came under control of foreign tribes and invaders. Enemy mountaineers, living in the high regions of Zagros, confidently seized the foothills and mountain passes, threatening the connection with the outside world. Aramaic tribes, previously just isolated groups, now established their camps practically at the gates of ancient Ashur and approached close to the edge of the Tigris Valley, threatening the integrity of Assyrian territory. As a result, the area where Assyria was concentrated consisted of a narrow strip of land along the Tigris River, surrounded on all sides by enemies ready at any moment to exploit the region's weakness. Despite all these difficult circumstances, there are reasons for a certain optimism in the historical sources. Firstly, Assyria's enemies, it seems, could not unite into a single powerful army capable of completely destroying the state. Throughout almost his entire history, he hated his enemies slightly less than the Assyrians did, and this division played an important role in the survival of the Assyrian people. On the plains of Iraq, where there were no natural borders or defensive structures, Assyria had to rely solely on its ability to constantly resist enemies by alternately displaying its strength. A powerful army armed with chariots, bows, and weapons could conduct offensive operations in multiple directions simultaneously, allowing it to defeat each opponent individually and maintain its independence. In the following centuries, Assyrian kings deliberately adhered to this strategy, doing everything possible to prevent the enemies from uniting and to avoid being trapped in a dangerous encirclement. At the same time, despite the crisis, the main city of Assyria, Ashur, was practically unaffected during the Bronze Age crisis and continued to function as the center of economic and administrative life. Its inhabitants persisted in craftsmanship, trade, and cultural traditions, maintaining internal stability. The Assyrians preserved their chariots, horses, weapons, and combat skills. Meanwhile, they gained access to a new material, iron, which became increasingly important in the military sphere over the years. This metal was used not only for ceremonial items and jewelry but primarily as the foundation for producing weapons and armor. The advent of iron meant that the Assyrian army could completely abandon dependence on copper, the material imported from distant and hard-to-reach mines in Afghanistan, since iron was found in the Earth's crust 10 times more often and could be used virtually anywhere. This significantly expanded the capabilities of the armed forces and strengthened their combat effectiveness. Trained for battle and hardened through numerous fights, Assyrian generals became some of the best military strategists of their time. Most importantly, the line of royal succession in Assyria, according to all indications, was not interrupted for more than 200 years, giving the kings a unique advantage. This continuity reaffirmed their ancient and undisputed status, making them legitimate rulers in the eyes of the people. At this time, no other state in the region could boast such a long and stable history of dynastic unity. Based on all of this, an Assyrian king could be confident in his strength and rights, since he had a powerful historical foundation. Such a person, possessing ancient legitimacy, could at a crucial moment seize the emerging opportunity and make Assyria one of the greatest states in the world. He believed that his rule, like an indomitable bastion, could raise the country again and lead it to new heights of a mighty empire. This man bore the name Tiglath, and he was the one who could become the force to change the course of history, turning the fate of the Assyrian people toward a brighter future. Pul-ezer I, also known as Teglath, ascended to the Assyrian throne in 1104 BCE. His reign was not only the inheritance of familial privileges but also the dark legacy of his father, a cruel and ruthless ruler named Ashur-shah-I-Shia, known for his harsh war tactics and uncompromising conquests. In history, he is remembered as the avenger of Assyria and the merciless hero of battles, symbols of strength and brutality. Among the surviving documents from his era is an edict stating that any connection with court ladies was punishable by a brutal death by fire. It is clear that Teglath inherited part of this formidable reputation along with the throne, as his early surroundings and the laws of the time clearly testify to the harsh and even cruel customs of his rule. During his reign, a code of laws was created, known as the Middle Assyrian Code, reflecting the strictness and severity of the period. In these laws, women were subjected to particularly strict control. For example, a married woman accused of treason could face the death penalty. However, despite his reputation as a warrior and lawgiver, Teglath also demonstrated himself as an energetic ruler and a talented military commander. In one of his inscriptions, he describes himself as the unrivaled king of the universe, ruler of the four worlds, and the lord of all princes and rulers. He believed that his weapon was sanctified by the god Ashur, and all his activities are confirmed by mentions in oral and written sources to strengthen his power and recognition. Teglath often compared himself to a bright, blazing fire that, like a pouring rain, engulfs and washes over enemy lands, turning them into ruins. Such exaggerated self-praise was characteristic of all Assyrian monarchs. However, in Teglath's case, it especially highlighted his remarkable courage and determination. He inherited an empire beset by numerous threats at the time. In the north, climate changes facilitated the movement of nomadic tribes into the northern plains, creating additional difficulties in stabilizing power. In the Syrian uplands, near the sources of the Euphrates, the Mushku people seized some territories of the Assyrian state. During the same period, the Hittites occupied part of these lands, while the powerful Babylon was located south, within the boundaries of Assyrian control. But Teglath-Pileser immediately took decisive measures. He began by attacking the Mushku, achieved victory, and drove the Hittites out of their occupied lands. Everywhere he advanced, he left evidence of his victories, traces that confirmed the strength of his army and his unwavering desire for expansion. One of the memorable manifestations of his activity was an inscription on copper plates, placed at the foundation of fortresses along the borders of his kingdom. Part 13 of 65. In these accounts, he claimed that throughout his life he had conquered 42 lands and subdued many of their rulers, from the distant mountainous regions beyond the Zaba River to the other side of the Euphrates, including the lands of the Hutti people and the Upper Sea area in the west. King T also had a passion for hunting. He enjoyed bringing live exotic animals from distant lands, participating in hunting expeditions where he sometimes killed large and powerful beasts. For example, he personally slaughtered 10 male elephants in the Haran district and along the shores of the Haber River. After capturing 4 live elephants, he brought their skins, tusks, and the animals themselves to his city, Ashur. It is hard to imagine the impression such achievements made on ordinary Assyrian inhabitants, for it was difficult to document everyday life achievements clearly. But one thing was clear: it seemed that the wealth gained from these campaigns flowed into the treasury, filling it with precious gifts and treasures. Following the expansion of borders, intensive work was underway in the capital cities. Builders constructed new palaces, auxiliary buildings, magnificent gardens with exotic plants and fountains. On city streets, one could observe rare animals previously unknown to common citizens, creating a miraculous spectacle for the residents. Meanwhile, during T the Giant's era, the Assyrian kingdom experienced rapid development, filled with military victories, legislation, and opulence that appeared to be immortalized in every stone slab and every living creature under his rule. Thanks to the emergence of new trade routes, wealth in the form of diverse spices and fabrics began to appear in the marketplaces. These changes opened new horizons for merchants and buyers, transforming trade into an art form that filled markets with vivid colors and fragrant aromas. During this period, power in Assyria was concentrated in the hands of a leader named T, who, seeking to expand his dominions, sent his combat squads westward. As a result of his campaigns and the capture of the city Katov Petru, he gained control over an important route leading to the Mediterranean Sea, a body of water that for the Assyrians was not just a water source but also a boundary of the unknown world, a symbol of distant horizons and inaccessible expanses. At that time, Assyria remained the only great regional power that did not even have access to oceanic waters, making its internal politics and ambitions especially significant. The memory of T.S. first great sea voyages sounds like a miracle. As a king, he sailed on a ship for the first time in his life and proudly recounted how he first stepped onto the water's surface. Syrian chronicles, shedding light on his deeds, even mention an unusual sea creature with which, according to their reports, the legislative and military leader encountered during his maritime adventures. It is written that he killed a mysterious sea beast called Nakhr. One of his descriptions states, "I killed Naharu, who is called the seahorse in the Great Sea of Amuru." These words reflect his pride and admiration for his extraordinary deeds in the maritime domain. However, what exactly lay behind this mysterious creature remains unknown to this day. Some historians suggest that it could have been a dolphin or even a large marine predator, such as a cetacean. Others believe that something more unusual might have been involved, for example, a hippopotamus inhabiting the waters of those distant times. But it is this enigmatic story that highlights how extraordinary Taglad-Pallasar's early voyages in the waters were for him, since he, as a king, had no prior experience of sea travel and was encountering the power of the maritime element for the first time. Taglad-Pallasar ruled until the year 1807 of our era, and at the time of his death, he likely looked back on his rich and vibrant past, filled with great achievements. During his reign, the Assyrian state managed to recover a significant portion of the lost territories, previously lost during the Bronze Age crisis, and transformed into a mighty empire, surpassing many neighboring peoples of the region in strength. His rule became a time of glory, when he looked confidently into the future, foretelling a golden age for his country, filled with even greater accomplishments and territorial expansion. However, the fate of the state was subject to an unexpected and radical change with the ascent to power of a new king named Adad-Nirari. He was crowned in the year 1310 BCE, which approximately corresponds to the 3rd millennium BCE, nearly 3,000 years ago. His reign marked the first time in regional history that the date could be precisely pinpointed by specific years. Such accuracy had not been achieved before. Unlike modern calendar systems based on numbers, the Assyrians used a unique system for numbering years. Instead of direct dates, each year was given a special name, often linked to an important event, so that future generations would have records of what transpired during that time. Sometimes, these names were associated with the names of political or military leaders, notable battles, or astronomical phenomena such as solar eclipses. The lists of year names kept by Assyrian scribes were quite extensive and contained brief notes about the events, like chains linking the art of remembrance and the history of that era. For example, one of these year names indicates that in the late 6th century BCE, in a year called Kamerjara, the construction of a new temple in the city of Dersha-Shurukan in honor of a god began. In another year, during a solar eclipse, a temple was founded in the same city, and in a third year, in honor of the ruler Habruri, Shamash-Bakir, the city of Kamuki was conquered and taken, with a new ruler installed. In the year called Shashardu, the ruler Tushanu ascended to the throne, and the king returned from Babylon accompanied by high officials and nobility. Over the following years, significant military spoils were captured and destroyed, the city of Durjakan, which testified to major military victories. Additionally, in the year when the name Tishlita was used, an important religious event was celebrated in the cities dedicated to the gods Dersharukan, the entrance of divine spirits into their temples. This entire system of naming and events served as an important tool for preserving history, allowing modern scholars to precisely determine dates and link them to significant past events. Physicians, historians, and astronomers of that time placed great importance on solar eclipses, considering them prophetic signs from the gods, and actively recorded such phenomena in their annals, making the Assyrian Chronicle a particularly valuable source for contemporary researchers. Their careful and meticulous documentation of everything that occurred was one of their distinctive features. Thanks to this approach, the accession of Adad-Nirari, one of the earliest and most prominent examples of new eras in history, was recorded. This ambitious ruler soon began expanding the borders of his empire, covering lands that are now part of modern Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. His military campaigns, which expanded his holdings, advanced in various directions, with the Mediterranean coast protected by the formidable Assyrian army, ready to repel any threats. The life of an Assyrian warrior was filled with harsh trials and hard work. Most of their lives were spent on farms, close to their families, engaged in farming and household chores. They dug irrigation canals, cultivated the land with plows and hand tools, grew beans, wheat, and barley, and raised livestock, sheep, pigs, and cattle. During this season, when rains ended and winter snow and mud disappeared, they were called into the army. They were issued spears and shields woven from reed and sent to sacred rocky hills or barren deserts, where they fought for their empire. Sometimes, their opponents were settled communities, inhabitants of fortified towns with defensive walls protecting their homes and wealth. In other cases, they faced nomadic tribes or even rebellious Assyrian detachments. In any case, such encounters were a true test for everyone. For many, military service was a terrifying and incomprehensible ordeal. It is no wonder that most soldiers and officers harbored hatred for the required duties and obligations. However, among them were those who probably found some pleasure in the process. The pinnacle of pride was likely achieved by those who had never seen mountain peaks or the sea, let alone those who were limited by the borders of their small village or town and knew nothing beyond that life, except for annual military expeditions. Perhaps it was precisely because the Assyrian army often emerged victorious that the warriors and their commanders developed a sense of collective pride in their achievements and strength. The customary rhythm, in which autumn brought harvest and spring brought war, became a vital part of the empire's way of life. This was a rhythm of constant expansion, conquest, and victory, a process that continued under the king who ascended the throne on August 11, 883 BC, Ashurnasirpal. He was a fierce and relentless warrior, a true embodiment of the traits that the Assyrian kings were renowned for. His qualities, fearsome cruelty, harsh methods of dealing with enemies, and relentless brutality reached their peak during his reign. Like most rulers of his time, he likely employed tactics of terror and executions to instill fear in his opponents' hearts. His royal inscriptions, despite recounting brutal events, are marked by a distinctive enthusiasm and pride in his actions. After quelling another rebellion and consolidating his power, he ordered a record to be created that emphasized his strength and brutality. In this inscription, he claims, "I burned numerous prisoners and captured dozens of soldiers alive.
Some I cut off hands and wrists, others I gouged out noses, ears, and limbs. There were even those I blinded. Gathering them all alive, I placed them in one heap along with one of their heads and hung these heads on trees around the city. I destroyed young men and women, laid waste to and completely absorbed this city, turning it into ruins." Thanks to this brutal tactic, or perhaps despite it, Ashurnasirpal became a powerful and effective conqueror. States allied with or subordinate to Assyria were forced to pay enormous tribute, bringing unprecedented wealth to the empire's capital. Inspired by his successes, Ashurnasirpal did not remain idle. He magnificently celebrated his victories by building increasingly grand and luxurious palaces, symbols of his authority and power. For his royal residence, I constructed a magnificent palace from precious woods, cedar, cypress, juniper, boxwood, turpentine, and tamarisk, to ensure comfort and contemplation amid luxurious materials. At the entrances, I placed statues of animals made from white limestone and alabaster, representing mountain ranges and sea expanses, emphasizing the palace's connection to nature and the grandeur of the world. The building's design was executed with extraordinary taste and elegance. Doors made of cedar and cypress, crafted masterfully, opened into spacious portals, and inside, carvings and decorations created an atmosphere of wealth and majesty. The palace interior was adorned with treasures, silver, gold, tin, bronze, and iron, all precious metals brought from conquered lands to emphasize the wealth and power of the state. I also carried out the resettlement of people who had been subdued through the strength and will of my warriors in distant lands. Although these resettlements were not a novelty, I conducted them far more actively and on a larger scale than my predecessors, understanding the importance of human resources and the strength of populated centers. At that time, it was a common belief that the size of the population was directly linked to the power of the state and its stability. Therefore, the Assyrians aimed to settle their cities with peoples from various corners of the empire, creating urban centers where multiple cultures and languages coexisted. As a result, they transformed their cities into some of the most cosmopolitan and diverse places of those distant times, turning them into true multi-ethnic hubs. Of course, not everyone welcomed these relocations with joy. One can only imagine the feelings of the conquered peoples who were forcibly evicted from their native villages and moved to the great cities of the empire. These cities surpassed all their former dwellings in size, and hundreds of languages and dialects sounded on the streets, creating a unique atmosphere of cultural mixing.
Nonetheless, such measures were used not only to strengthen the state but also as a harsh punishment for those who dared to resist. In this sense, the deportation policy reached a particularly severe level under Ashurnasirpal. Deportation seemed less terrible compared to the horrors faced by those who opposed the Assyrian rulers. In reality, it was a very harsh but highly effective tactic for suppressing resistance, consolidating power, and eliminating potential sources of rebellion. The understanding of the connection between humans and nature, as well as the environment, was deeply rooted in the consciousness of people of that era. Therefore, forced relocations inflicted profound psychological wounds on the peoples who were forced to abandon their native lands and move into unknown regions. Such mass deportation tactics proved so effective that subsequent regimes also adopted them. For example, in the 20th century, Stalin deported at least 6 million people, members of more than 20 different ethnic minorities whom he considered a potential threat to societal stability. At the dawn of the colonial era in the Americas, indigenous peoples also endured tragedy. They were forcibly moved to different regions to break their connection with their homeland, significantly reducing their chances of resistance or escape. Despite all the cruelty and suffering caused by these measures, King Ashurnasirpal managed to preserve his empire and even greatly expand its territory. However, his descendant, Crown Prince Salmanasar II, was not such a successful ruler. Following his father's conquest traditions, he continued a policy of harsh expansion and mass deportations, but new resistance and internal discontent grew increasingly widespread across the empire. Ultimately, the discontent reached such a level that a mass revolt erupted throughout the entire territory of the Assyrian Empire. Led by Salmanasar's son, who was declared a traitor, a mercenary and military commander, the rebellion spread across the vast empire, threatening the very existence of the state. 28 cities, including Ashur, rose up and revolted, indicating the extent of internal unrest. This prolonged and brutal civil war created conditions in which nearly all of Assyria's armed forces, loyal to King Ashurbanipal, were able to free themselves from his control. The period of Ashur's rule over the empire was marked not only by political ambitions but also by military supremacy, which provoked disapproval and dissatisfaction among neighboring peoples and regional states. It became clear that for the Assyrian state to maintain its power and continue its dominance, significant reforms and changes were necessary. One of the confident and determined rulers who understood this was King Tiglath-Pileser II, a man who believed he knew how to elevate the empire to a new level of development. His approach to reforming the army and government was far from softness and diplomatic concession, which many other political leaders often adhered to. In the true Assyrian spirit and with a characteristic sense of decisiveness, he set himself the task of strengthening the army, making it more powerful and formidable. By the mid-6th century BCE, the Assyrian army had grown to such a scale and strength that it could compare to the military forces of neighboring states. Most importantly, the number of troops significantly exceeded the armies of other regional powers. This was astonishing for the time. For example, Salmanasar III, son of the great Ashurnasirpal, could boast of an army numbering about 120,000 men. Meanwhile, the total world population at the time is estimated not to have exceeded 50 million people. According to inscriptions from that period, roughly 4%, or 1 in every 100 people, served in the Assyrian army. However, it is important to note that the majority of these soldiers were peasant masses with little training or professional military expertise. The only professional military specialists were the king's bodyguards and members of noble families, usually stationed in cities and palaces, where they did not participate in field battles. The front line of the Assyrian army essentially consisted of farmers, recruited from rural areas depending on the season, which created its own particular vulnerability. Despite its scale, this mobilization proved to be less than entirely effective. During the autumn, the harvest season for barley and other crops, the army of farmers had to hurriedly return to their homes to complete the sowing season and prepare for the next harvest, otherwise the empire risked facing famine. The mobilization of a large number of soldiers dispersing across the fields and returning to their villages was an extremely complex and labor-intensive process. Outbreaks of rebellion could occur at any time of the year. However, if uprisings arose in distant corners of the empire, the armies of Assyria were forced to wait until summer to begin active operations. Organizing such a large-scale gathering and redeployment of armed forces took at least several months. As for assembling a significant army, it took roughly a week. During this period, regiments would gather and set out, and another 1 or 2 months were needed to traverse the entire territory and join with the main forces. Just imagine, by the time they arrived at their destination, already at the end of the military campaign season, many soldiers, exhausted and worn out after a long journey, would be returning home on foot. In this context, if treacherous or rebellious cities had shown wisdom and prudence, they could simply have shut the gates of their fortresses and waited for the Assyrian troops to tire or leave without taking active action. And in most cases, this is exactly what happened. It was during this period, in 45 BCE, that a new king named Tiglath-Pileser II ascended the Assyrian throne. He adopted a royal name in memory of the legendary monarch who, more than 300 years earlier, raised Assyria to an unshakable and mighty level, paving the way to the Mediterranean and defeating the sea monster known as Nekir. This new king began implementing radical reforms in the army and state administration, aiming to make the Assyrian military machine one of the most modern and effective in the entire region. A particularly important transformation was of its core elite armored troops, cavalry units, and chariots. Under these reforms, the army became a true professional force for the first time, capable of acting cohesively and swiftly, ensuring the superiority of the Assyrian state. The Assyrian Empire, spanning vast lands, required that all conquered territories within its borders not only provided wealth and resources but also served as a strong rear base for further military campaigns. Ensuring the army was well supplied was a crucial task. Often, it was the infantry at the front, considered expendable, that suffered the most losses in battle. Such a strategy made every conquest highly costly, as constant replenishment and maintenance of armed forces demanded relentless development of infrastructure and resources. An important innovation was the role of military engineers among the Assyrian warriors. These specialists not only participated in battles but also assumed leadership roles in complex construction projects right on the battlefield. Assyrian engineers could build bridges necessary for river crossings, dig deep tunnels beneath enemy fortifications, construct defensive bastions, and operate siege engines. Moreover, they maintained supply lines, providing the army with food, ammunition, and all necessary resources. This fascinating combination of agile warriors and talented engineers prefigured the Roman military system, which more than 7 centuries later became one of the most powerful and advanced in history. Remarkably detailed scenes have been preserved in Assyrian carved images, depicting the movement of armies along the banks of great rivers in the land. It is believed that such campaigns took place regularly several times a year. These scenes show various means of transport made from sheepskins, which were used to craft rafts. Chariots, disassembled into parts and reassembled, were then used as watercraft, allowing rapid crossing of water obstacles. Platforms were also built specifically for transporting supplies and military gear. Military engineers could lay routes through intricate mountain ranges, finding the most advantageous paths for advancing troops through difficult terrain. In such cases, the Assyrian army demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and organizational skills, as evidenced by ancient inscriptions created in honor of the 7th Assyrian king Sargon II, expressing pride in the achievements of his subjects. These texts reveal a deep respect for engineering craftsmanship and military daring. Mount Cimmeria, vast and formidable, rises to the heavens like the blade of a giant spear. Its peak reaches the clouds, and its roots plunge into the abyss, impassable for chariots, animals, and even infantry. Conquering it is virtually impossible without special means and considerable effort. In response, I ordered my vanguard to arm themselves with sturdy copper axes. These tools allowed us to break through rocks, which concealed passages to the summit as if they were soft limestone. Thanks to their help, the route for the rest of the army became more accessible. I personally directed the advance of the front, commanding combat squads. Chariots with cavalry and honored fighters, like eagles in flight, unsuccessfully tried to surmount the steep slopes of the mountain. Following them, various infantry units, diverse divisions, ascended upward. Camels and donkeys, laden with heavy loads, skillfully climbed winding rocky paths, reminiscent of brave mountain goats. At such moments, I issued orders for the numerous troops dedicated to the god Ashur to overcome all obstacles easily and reach the summit. There, we set up camp, and at this height, a sense of triumph and celebration prevailed. At this time, Tiglath-Pileser, one of the greatest Assyrian kings, increased iron production, an essential metal that marked the start of a new era. This rapid development became practically a popular industrial revolution within the empire. Assyrian cities were likely filled with smoke from numerous furnaces emitting black clouds into the sky, and the noise of hammers and tumbling metal became an integral part of urban soundscapes. The use of iron opened new horizons for Assyrian craftsmen and soldiers. Now they could produce arrowheads, knives, chains, pins, and a wide array of other equipment from this metal. Soldiers armed with iron swords, spears, helmets, and scale armor worn over bright tunics marched boldly into battle, confident in their technical superiority. Their effectiveness on the battlefield was truly remarkable. In 23rd century BC, just 2 years after King Tiglath-Pileser I ascended to the throne, he campaigned northward against the kingdom of Urartu and emerged victorious. 2 years later, he headed west, attacking the neighboring city-state of Arpad. The residents of Arpad had long been familiar with the Assyrians and were well prepared for a possible assault. They understood that in order to survive and resist the enemy, they needed to close their gates and endure the siege bravely. Despite the intimidating appearance of the Assyrian troops, the people of Arpad hoped that by the end of summer, after harvesting crops from their fertile fields, the enemies would retreat and leave them in peace once again. These were the battles wherein one of the greatest empires of antiquity fought for dominance and territory, demonstrating its strength and mastery, while its enemies tried to hold out and preserve their lands, hoping for a better future. As the autumn months approached, the residents of Arpad likely began feeling anxious and sensing the grim reality they faced. The people within the city walls could no longer remain blind to external signs and events indicating impending disaster. At the same time, the besieging Assyrians showed complete indifference to returning to their original positions, seemingly deliberately refusing to abandon their occupation points. On the contrary, it appeared that they intended to stay as long as possible, as if planning to consolidate and turn this location into a permanent base for further operations. For 3 years, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser II besieged the city of Arpad, marking a period that was unimaginable for ordinary, peaceful military campaigns. Such an extended assault testified to the extreme persistence and unwavering determination of the enemy to achieve the complete defeat of the city. When finally the city's defenses collapsed and the enemy took Arpad, the Assyrian king ordered the city to be destroyed to its foundations and all its inhabitants to be massacred without exception. This brutal act was not merely an act of war but a powerful and terrifying message to all who remained in the path of this empire. It was ready to go to great lengths, sparing no one and nothing. This gesture heralded the beginning of a new era, an epoch when power and ruthlessness became the dominant criteria. Similar to modern states with global ambitions, the Assyrian Empire regarded the territories beyond its borders more as hunting grounds, where only raw materials and resources held value. The lives of the local inhabitants were virtually insignificant in this equation. These lands served as a source of wealth from which precious stones, materials, and labor were extracted to sustain prosperity and expand the empire. Documents from the era of the brutal King Ashur-nisirpal contain detailed descriptions of the riches acquired during one of the bloodiest expeditions directed against the Batmani region. Among the valuable trophies were chariots, equipment for troops and horses, 460 harnessed horses, as well as wealth in the form of 2 talents of silver, 2 talents of gold, 100 talents of tin, adequate quantities of bronze, and numerous bronze vessels, cups, containers, along with thousands of linen garments with various decorations. Various luxury items were also seized, ornate chests and beds made of ivory, as well as wealth stored in the royal palace. Additionally, the region's spoils included 2,000 bulls, 5,000 sheep, the king's sister with a rich dowry, and daughters of nobles who became part of his trophies. Equally important was the fact that Tiglath-Pileser, during his military campaigns, captured 50 slaves, whom he brought back to Assyria to serve in manual labor and meet the needs of the empire. In his conquests, he seized lands in Syria, traveling along the Mediterranean coast, including coastal cities all the way to Egypt. Hostilely entering the northern kingdom of Israel, he defeated its army, installed a puppet ruler, and deported many Jewish tribes back to Assyria. Among Tiglath-Pileser's notable conquests was the capture of the ancient and powerful capital of the southern region, the city of Babylon. This city was not only the seat of political power but also the religious heart of all Mesopotamia, an inseparable and great civilization that for over 1,000 years possessed grandeur and influence. Babylon was located in a marshy area covering most of southern present-day Iraq and stretching to the Persian Gulf Coast. In ancient times, it was the largest wetland area, filled with vegetation reaching incredible heights, seemingly concealing everything around beneath a thick layer of reeds. Historically, Mesopotamia was carefully divided into two major regions. The south was ruled by the Sumerians, and the north by peoples called Akkadians. Over time, this division evolved into a more specific separation. Babylonians ruled in the south, and Assyrians in the north. This cultural and political division continues to influence us to this day, and the borders between these peoples align with the modern line that divides Iraq into Sunni and Shia regions. For thousands of years, Babylon shone as one of the greatest cities in the world, and perhaps even became the first major settlement with a population of over 200,000 people.
Today, its remarkable ruins stretch about 85 kilometers south of modern Baghdad.
These ruins cover a vast area, where the broken walls of the ancient citadel have been preserved to this day. The famous gates and the outer fortress wall, decorated with blue glazed tiles depicting bulls, lions, and dragons, these were added later to embellish them further. But even without these additions, Babylon in ancient times gleamed under the sun as a bright and powerful city, attracting admiration for its scale and wealth. The conquest of Babylon by King Tiglath-Pileser II completely changed the political and military landscape of Mesopotamia. By 800 BC, his mighty empire covered almost the entire region then known as the Fertile Peninsula, a region where land, water, and climate favored agriculture. It stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, creating a continuous corridor linking the most important trade routes of the Indian Ocean with those passing through North Africa and Europe. The roads of this empire were filled with caravans of donkeys and camels shimmering in long columns, while barges floated along the rivers carrying treasures, precious stones, wheat, barley, fruits, gold, silver, and copper. This powerful empire was ruled by King Tiglath-Pileser IV, a wise and fearless leader, who handed over the throne to his younger son named Sargon II. This heir was named after the legendary Sumerian hero and became the founder of one of the greatest dynasties of the Assyrian era. The dynasty, known as the Sargonid kings, ruled for 3 generations, and during its peak, the Assyrian Empire reached the height of its power in military, artistic, and literary achievements. However, it was precisely during this period that the empire experienced its brightest and final flourishing phase. When the 3rd generation of rulers was replaced, the might of the state gradually weakened and eventually collapsed, leaving behind only ashes and ruins, a reminder of former grandeur. At this point, an important question arises: what was life like for the common people of this vast empire? What thoughts and feelings accompanied ordinary citizens in their daily lives? Thanks to preserved documents, we now possess many detailed insights into the everyday aspects of life in ancient Mesopotamia. Just as the Sumerians, the Assyrians also left their records on clay tablets, which proved to be a treasure trove for historians. These clay inscriptions have become a reliable source of information, as the clay preserved exceptionally well in the local climate and over time became a durable medium for storing letters, business records, and personal notes. A vast number of such documents have been discovered, and according to scholars' estimates, about 90% of them remain entirely unexplored by specialists, with only a few translated and interpreted. When reading these clay tablets, it feels as if a voice from centuries past whispers directly into your ears, sharing details about everyday life and extraordinary moments of ordinary people. One vivid example of such records is a letter written by a student from a school, an ordinary person whose words reveal details about his life. In it, he addresses his teacher or mentor and reports, "Please, pass on to Lady Zena that her son Aiden reports the following. Every year the clothing for teenagers here becomes more attractive and fashionable, but unfortunately, mine has already lost its freshness and beauty." Then he talks about his classmates, a daughter of Ada and Diano, whose paternity is limited to the fact that his father is my father's assistant, has 2 new sets of clothes, while I have not even one. These simple words not only convey material instability but also the tragedy of personal experiences. Despite the fact that you gave birth to me, and his mother merely adopted him, he feels love and care, unlike me. You do not show me the same warmth and tenderness. Through these everyday details, a quiet yet very vivid picture of ordinary people's lives emerges, striking with its sincerity and genuine humanity. These ancient texts offer us a unique opportunity to glimpse the life and customs of people who lived many centuries ago, highlighting the richness of their cultural traditions and architectural achievements. Imagine walking through the streets of a major Assyrian city of that time, a scene that could evoke the most intense emotions and admiration. One such magnificent city was Nineveh, which later became the center of a powerful Assyrian empire, blending its cultural heritage with legendary architectural accomplishments. It was here that a Greek traveler and writer Xenophon once visited, fleeing from the persecutions of the Persian army, which underscores the city's importance in ancient times.
Nineveh was a formidable and impressive city for its era.
Its city walls stretched for 12 kilometers, a massive stone structure covered with clay bricks, making the city's defenses almost insurmountable. These fortifications surrounded an area of 7.5 square kilometers, creating a powerful framework for urban life. The walls were pierced by numerous gates. There were a total of 15, many of which bore names associated with deities: the Gate of Adad, dedicated to the god of storms and waters, or the Gate of Shemus, named after the god of the sun and light. Among them were also more utilitarian entrances, such as gates leading to the desert or gates intended for water carriers, indicating the multifunctionality of the city's fortifications. The entire city was surrounded by a moat filled with the waters of the Tigris River, which served as a natural defense and supplied daily life with water. The architecture of the city and its street plan impressed with intricate patterns, elegant forms, and meticulous finishing, making it one of the most magnificent cities of antiquity. Inside Nineveh, dozens of roofs stretched out, built without a strictly fixed plan. Narrow, winding streets were paved with reed mats, and reed awnings were raised overhead to shield residents from the scorching sun. This practice still exists in modern Iraq. Within the courtyards of homes, if they could be called so, earthenware bottles filled with exquisite wine and jugs of drinking water hung on wooden beams. Everything was organized to cool the air during hot weather and create a comfortable atmosphere for the inhabitants. It's imagined that meat chunks simmered over a hearth in clay pots, and enticing aromas of freshly baked bread emanated from charcoal stoves, filling the entire city and creating a sense of coziness and home warmth. The recipe for stewed lamb carved into a clay tablet shows how fragrant dishes were prepared at that time and reveals how everyday life was rich in tastes and smells. To make this delicacy, one needed to take a piece of meat, pour water into the body of a cooking vessel, add a bit of fat and salt, small dried barley flatbreads, onions, shallots, and milk. Everything was carefully mixed, then green onions and garlic were added. Such a dish was not just food but a reflection of a complex culinary culture that brought joy and satisfied not only the body but the senses as well. Alongside this, as in Sumerian lands, the Aryans inhabiting these regions highly valued beer. They gladly uncorked large jars, from which they drank through straws, enjoying the beverage in the company of friends, creating a special atmosphere of celebration and unity. Beer occupied an important place in Assyrian culture, as evidenced by inscriptions on clay tablets.
King Ashurbanipal, judging by his records, regarded beer as one of the noblest pleasures of life.
In his writings, he stated, "In my days of prosperity, during my rule, abundance. My reign is glorious, like premium oil. I keep good beer in my palace to enjoy it during moments of leisure." Such words reveal how highly this drink was valued and how it was an integral part of the cultural and social life of the great states of that era. Nineveh, located on the bank of the Tigris River, was a bustling port with a quay where gates known as the dock gates stood. This noisy and busy area was filled with the scents of fresh and dried fish, stagnant water, and rotten mud, as well as the sounds of banging and traders' voices arguing over prices and greeting each other in numerous languages. Merchants floated downstream in flat-bottomed boats or reed-built vessels. They moved down the river, possibly southward, towards Ashur or Babylon, carrying clay jars of beer or wine that would soon find their customers.
The following line is a letter from a wine merchant to his friend.
He asks him to convey specific words: "May the god Shamash keep you in good health. Please prepare for me fragrant reed and fresh bread, as I have already mentioned, as well as prepare a boat for transporting wine." These words vividly demonstrate the business and personal connections that existed between merchants and their clients. They show how important trade and the exchange of goods were in the daily life of ancient cities, and also how much each carefully chosen word was filled with respect and concern for comrades and partners. "Prepare 10 silver shekels, this is the cost of your wine, and don't forget to bring them here tomorrow, to our place in Babylon, so you can join my company and share in the joy of today." However, remember that the Tigris was like a swift river. It flowed faster than the Euphrates, and returning upstream was quite a challenging task. As a result, merchants often preferred to return overland, accompanied by mule caravans, to reach their cities away from dangerous water currents. Over time, the system of roads and routes was significantly transformed compared to the Sumerian era. Now, a complex and branching network connected all major cities of Assyria, and at regular intervals, special signs and markers were installed along the routes to warn travelers how much further they had to go to reach their destination. Despite this, the journey remained perilous, and even with regular patrols by troops, banditry was still widespread. One of the governor's letters expressed his dissatisfaction with the authorities' insufficiency in combating bandits. He voiced his concern, "I have repeatedly asked your service to send the criminal and all the robbers here, but your efforts have proved inadequate." As a result, these bandits continue to set fires, destroy agricultural lands, and cause great damage to our fields. For all this inaction and failure, the full responsibility lies with you. In the cities, life was literally boiling on the rooftops of houses. During the day, women gathered upstairs to attend to daily chores, grinding grain into flour, preparing dough for bread, cooking food, doing laundry, and hanging clothes out to dry in the sun. One can imagine how they moved from roof to roof, exchanging news and jokes, their laughter echoing throughout the city, creating a lively and unique atmosphere. During the hottest hours of the day, when the Iraqi sun beat down with an unbearable heat exceeding 40 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, residents sought refuge inside buildings. In such houses, especially the most beautiful and wealthy ones, cool rooms with floors made of reeds or stone were specially arranged where one could escape the scorching heat, feel the freshness, and rest. In Assyrian homes, floors were made from polished alabaster or marble, and the walls were covered with plaster, helping to keep the interior cool. During the most intense heat, walls and floors were sprayed with water, creating a slight cooling effect that made life in the shade of the wall more bearable. At night, the city's inhabitants, exhausted from the daytime heat, covered themselves with reed mats and went to sleep, while many prosperous citizens preferred soft wooden beds with mattresses and cozy blankets. The wealthiest might sleep on beds made of ivory and carved wood, symbolizing their riches and high status. Assyrians believed that the world was inhabited by invisible demons and spirits constantly influencing daily life. These entities, in their view, polluted the air with unpleasant odors, causing illnesses and ailments. Special exorcism rituals were performed to rid themselves of these spirits, requiring constant attention and skill. In one letter addressed to provincial authorities, a detailed description was given of the procedure for exorcising evil spirits from a person suffering from epilepsy. According to this account, when an attack seized the patient, the exorcist would stand to conduct the ritual. He would hang a surgical instrument in a thornbush branch above the house door, and himself would dress in red, put on a red cloak over his shoulders. In his right hand, he held a sparrow, and in his left, a falcon, reciting a spell, "Truly, you are evil." This was part of a ritual to oppose supernatural forces. After that, one of the exorcists would walk around the patient's bed with incense and a torch, reciting incantations, "Go away, evil Hutupu," until the demon is expelled. This ritual was performed to banish the spirit and alleviate the person's suffering, as the Assyrians believed that only in this way could they rid themselves of obsessive evil forces hindering recovery. Mornings and evenings became ritualized, repeated daily, to protect the home from evil spirits and negative forces infiltrating the dwelling. To achieve this, special amulets, small figurines made of bronze, clay, or precious stones such as jasper, were often placed inside homes and on doorways. These amulets depicted terrifying creatures, demons with menacing wings and grotesque heads, sometimes with goat-like horns or canine features, as well as scorpion tails. They were placed in every corner of the house to ward off evil and unwelcome visitors who disturbed the inhabitants' tranquility. During walks around the city, these amulets were commonly seen, small statuettes hanging from rooftops or at the entrances to homes. One of the most revered and frequently used household items of the Assyrians were cylindrical seals. These miniature stone cylinders were used for various purposes, especially those related to protecting against evil spirits and malevolent entities. Their size could vary, sometimes no larger than a battery, yet they were decorated with intricate patterns and symbols, giving each its unique character. The primary function of such seals was to verify the identity of their owner. They served as a signature substitute and were used when signing contracts. People wore these cylinders around their necks, on cords or strings, like jewelry, allowing them to keep them always at hand. When it was necessary to secure a text or agreement inscribed on clay, a cylinder was used, pressed onto the surface, leaving a unique imprint that served as the owner's individual signature. Additionally, cylinders were widely used for sealing chests, urns, or doors, which were then affixed with clay or warm wax. This method ensured the contents' security from outsiders and also served as a guarantee of secrecy about the person who opened or sealed the object. Official documents, letters, and orders placed special emphasis on written instructions, such as the one addressed to a high-ranking member of the royal family. They highlighted the importance of these cylindrical seals in administrative and judicial spheres. Their use was not only a lawful confirmation and affirmation of authority but also a symbol of power and authority. One such letter mentioned that Maneo, a sort of official or trusted agent, was to prepare quest cylinders, one for sealing the warehouse entrance, and another featuring an image of the monster Lakmu, intended for resealing chests. The instructions also emphasized that all participants in the joint ceremony should gather together to open the warehouse and take out as much clothing as they could carry. The items were stored in chests sealed with the owner's special cylindrical seals, and when returning the items, each had to be stamped with its own mark. Afterward, the used seals with their impressions were to be returned to their place, either to the storage or to the person who provided them. It should be noted that such cylinders were quite expensive and served as a sign of their owner's high social status and wealth. Ordinary people in everyday life managed without complex stamps and simply pressed their nails into soft clay. This was done to sign agreements, affirming their rights and commitments. Thanks to these fingerprints, we can still trace how the hands of those distant times looked. The inhabitants of the great Assyrian cities, scattered across a vast empire, probably knew little about the inner life of the mighty palaces, towering over their small settlements. They watched with interest as kings arrived and departed, as if following events in a distant and mysterious capital, much like celebrities' news. Inside the palace walls, a complex and incomprehensible life was unfolding, which for ordinary people seemed just as inaccessible and mysterious as the very heart of the earth. Nevertheless, what happened behind those high walls, laws, rituals, appointments, was of great importance, for the fate of all subjects depended on the decisions and actions of the kings. When the last great dynasty of Assyrian rulers, so-called Sargonids, came to the throne, events and dramas unfolding within the palaces quickly took on a tragic character for the entire nation. The capital palaces were not only centers of governance but also hubs of intrigue and power struggles, which often led to bloodshed. The history of this dynasty begins with Sargon's son, a man named Sennacherib, who ascended the throne in 705 BC. It was he who was destined to be the father and ancestor of the last two great Assyrian kings, Ashurhaddon and Ashurbanipal. Their reign marked the end of an era that left a deep mark on regional history. This story begins with rather complex and complicated events. At its center is the fate of the powerful and simultaneously formidable ruler Sargon, father of Sennacherib. He genuinely earned the respect of his subjects, but his involvement in his life and rule was also a source of fear for those around him. However, despite his outward strength and authority, within Sennacherib himself there were traits that seemed not entirely consistent with his high achievements and military fame. Already 2 years into his reign, events occurred that forever changed the face and course of history. At a time when the Assyrian Empire was reaching rapid heights, several subjects living in the eastern foothills, in the depths of Syrian lands and along the Mediterranean coast, suddenly decided to refuse tribute to their ruler. This act was not accidental. The Egyptians, known for their tendency toward insubordination and frequent revolts, supported these rebels, deciding to fight for their independence. As a result, Sennacherib found himself drawn into a very serious, tense confrontation to preserve his authority and dominance. Nevertheless, he did not despair and quickly mobilized the full strength of the imperial army. Raised and hardened by war, he resolutely began to follow the old Assyrian tactic to destroy his enemies one by one, drop by drop, exactly as his predecessors had done. First, he headed east, where he fought against the peoples and tribes of the Iranian plateau, defeating them one after another. Then, turning north, he circled around the Fertile Crescent stretching along the Mediterranean Sea and reached the borders of the rebellious territories, restoring his authority there once again. In his inscriptions and chronicles, he wrote about his victory: "By the power of the weapon of the god Ashur, my lord, and my unyielding will, I have gained the victory over the enemies. I swiftly dispersed their forces, captured the earthly king of Elam and his associates, adorned with gold like well-fed bulls, and executed them, slitting their throats like sheep. Their blood poured onto the earth, turning it into a stream, like a river bursting after a rainstorm. Sensing the smell of blood, the swift horses of my chariot sprang into that flow with sharp leaps. The wheels of my war chariot, meant for destruction and punishment, were covered with blood and fragments of bodies. I filled the plain with the corpses of enemies, just as grass is gathered after grazing, and like harvesting vegetables, I cut their lips and hands. Among the known battles, there is one for which reports from both the victors and the defeated have survived, so detailed is the account of this fight. It became especially significant because it is recorded both in the Assyrian Chronicles and in the Bible.
It concerns the confrontation between Sennacherib and the kingdom of Judah.
Judah was one of the two main Jewish states in that region, and its defeat marked a key moment in Assyrian expansion. At the heart of this kingdom was the great city, Jerusalem. Once, it was a unified Israelite state, but under the pressure of Assyrian aggression, it disintegrated into two independent kingdoms. The northern kingdom Israel, dependent on Assyria, and the southern Judah, which in turn maintained relative autonomy. At that time, the king of Judah was Hezekiah, a vigorous and decisive man known for his religious zeal and devotion to his people and faith. In the religious practices of the Israelites, there was a strict rule: worship was permitted only to one God, Yahweh.
In contrast, in Assyria, religious diversity was an everyday reality.
People offered sacrifices to Marduk when they were in Babylon on official duties or to Ashur when returning home. If a parent sent his son on a distant voyage by sea, sacrifices would be made to the goddess Ea, believed to be the guardian of maritime routes and travel. When some of your acquaintances fell ill, you most likely sought to offer sacrifices to the gods to appease them and rid yourself of misfortune. In ancient Assyrian traditions, there existed an impressive, sometimes even brutal understanding of divine power and its manifestations. The Assyrians viewed the deities of other cities and nations as foreign, often hostile beings subordinate to the great god Ashur, the supreme deity of their pantheon. Despite this, they recognized the existence and reality of these gods, considering them real powers with whom one must reckon. There existed even an ancient and somewhat harsh tradition of stealing statues and images of enemy gods, especially upon the conquest of a new city. Such a capture was seen not only as a display of victory but also as an attempt to touch the power of the defeated deities in order to use it for their own purposes. After capturing a city, statues and sacred images were taken to the Assyrian capital, where they became part of religious and magical rituals, giving the Assyrians confidence in their invincibility or helping them gain strong protection. In contrast, the Jewish religion claimed the exclusive existence of one God, whom the believers in Israel and Judah served and worshipped. For the Jews, worship of any other deity was considered not only sacrilege and defilement of the sacred, but also a sign of deep disrespect for their one true God. In the worst cases, it could lead to spiritual dangers, communication with evil spirits or demons, which was regarded as a serious crime against God. One of the most zealous and devout kings of ancient Judah, known for his political and spiritual rigor, was characterized by a strictness that became his hallmark. He decided to eliminate all forms of idolatry. Such was the initiative of King Hezekiah, one of the most steadfast pro-religious rulers of that time. He carried out extensive reforms aimed at purifying the faith and restoring the people's true worship of Yahweh. On the 18th year of his reign, he issued a decree for the complete exile and destruction of the statues and images that adorned the temple, in order to cleanse its sacred space. According to descriptions in the books of Kings, chapters 2 and 18, these measures were part of his fight for the purity of the faith. As early as the 3rd year of his reign, which coincided with the year when the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, son of Ilu, ascended the throne, Hezekiah began his rule over Judah, a self-governing state eager for renewal and spiritual revival. He emulated his ancestor, King David, and decided to live according to God's commandments, following his example in righteous and pious living. Among his primary decisions was the eradication of pagan cults, the destruction of altars and shrines, and the elimination of the worship of the ancient bronze serpent, which was associated with one of the earliest sacred rituals established by Moses. This serpent, once offered in sacrifice and revered as a symbol of divine protection by the Israelites, had become an object of idolatry over time and needed to be destroyed. Perhaps it was his exceptional religious devotion and faith in God that drove him to take a decisive and risky step, confronting the mighty Assyrian Empire, which at that time was one of the largest and most fearsome forces of the ancient world. Or perhaps recent events in Assyria, its internal revolts and crises, instilled in him confidence that the empire was on the verge of collapse, that his enemy had seemingly lost its invincibility. Nevertheless, these hopes proved illusory. Soon, he received alarming news that the Assyrian king Sennacherib was planning a campaign against Judah to punish it for disobedience and to demonstrate his strength through the full might of his army. These reports from the north caused deep fear and anxiety among the people. At the very beginning of his campaign, Sennacherib achieved an important victory over the rebellious city of Lachish, one of the largest fortified cities in Judah, located on a hill about 40 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. Its formidable defensive walls encompassed the entire area, with the northern gates being particularly strong, situated where the hill sharply declined into the valley. The inhabitants of Lachish could only guess what was unfolding before their eyes. Massive clouds of dust began to gather on the horizon, filling the sky more and more and foretelling approaching danger. As the enemy's advance grew closer, the noise grew louder, earthen stones trembled beneath their feet, and the distant rumble of heavy riders, chariots, and marching soldiers could be heard. One can only imagine what the city's residents felt when, along narrow streets and courtyards, the roar and crash of approaching troops intensified with each step. When the enemy finally appeared, they appeared as a dark cloud covering the land, so densely packed was the encirclement. At the center of the enemy army were tight ranks of infantry, their sun-glinting spears reaching toward the sky, creating an intimidating sight. No less threatening were the massive siege engines, capable of breaching city walls and conquering even the most fortified defenses. Compared to the power and scale of the Assyrian army, the captured city of Lachish appeared insignificant and weak, like a tiny replica in a vast military machine. Its defenders consisted only of a small number of local militia and mercenaries, huddled behind the ancient walls of Lachish, which seemed an utterly insufficient barrier against the approaching troops. These fortifications, though impressive at first glance, left an impression of being unreliable and temporary protection. The scene becomes even more vivid when events of that time are depicted in a splendid series of carved figures and panels, executed with incredible precision and finesse by master craftsmen. These works of art decorated the walls of the southwestern palace of Sennacherib in Nineveh, and they conveyed not only the history but also the sense of majesty and danger of that time. Some of these carved images were previously painted with bright colors, where each detail was highlighted with rich shades of green, blue, red, and yellow. These reliefs are a true treasure for archaeologists because, despite their artistic beauty and craftsmanship, they depict events that inspire fear and awe, scenes of battles, rebellious mobs, and destruction. They seem to capture important moments in history that might otherwise have vanished without a trace, preserving images of elite soldiers' clothing, weapon elements, as well as turbulent scenes of clashes and battles. Initially, the Assyrians set up camp near the city, preparing for a protracted and exhausting siege, demonstrating their engineering skill and ingenuity. Over several weeks, they gradually built a complex system of ramps made of stone blocks and earth, designed to breach the city walls. These efforts required meticulous work and complete concentration. At the same time, Assyrian soldiers and craftsmen worked day and night, supported by numerous laborers who manufactured clay bricks for building the ramp, baking them in the sun. During these operations, the defenders of Lachish faced constant pressure. Arrows and stones launched from slings struck all around, creating an atmosphere of danger and despair. Archaeological excavations at the site of this siege camp reveal how harsh the conditions were for the city's defenders. At one point, they ran out of metal arrowheads and had to carve them out of bone, clearly indicating their desperation and resource scarcity during the defense. When the ramp was finally completed, the Assyrians began deploying powerful siege engines, reminiscent of mechanized tanks of the ancient world. These massive wooden structures, resembling mobile fortresses, were mounted on heavy wheels, allowing them to be moved toward the city walls. At the top of these machines were towers from which archers shot, posing a threat to the defenders. The front of these devices featured a special tool, a complex combination of a battering ram, spear, and hammer designed to break through the clay walls and breach enemy fortifications. Its use was especially dangerous for the defenders, as it could slip between bricks and demolish entire sections of the wall. The defenders, in turn, did not cease their efforts to fight back. They constantly attempted to set fire to the siege engines, covering them with wet animal hides to reduce their effectiveness. However, Assyrian workers hurried to the front lines with pitchers and water skins to extinguish emerging fires and prevent the siege engines from being destroyed. In addition to siege engines, the Assyrians also installed ladders along the city walls and towers to breach the interior. The defenders continued to shoot arrows and throw stones, attempting to disable these structures, but their resistance was already doomed. The defenses were collapsing, and panic seized the residents of Lachish, who hastily scattered in different directions. Ultimately, the Assyrian army burst into the city, and from that moment, the scene takes on particular significance. The carvings on the walls seem to transform into a depiction of evacuation and destruction. As punishment for their resistance, the city was completely destroyed, and the inhabitants, overwhelmed with fear and despair, were surrounded and deported beyond their homeland, across the Tigris River. In the surviving images, we see them leaving their city in long columns, men and women riding carts drawn by oxen, loaded with their belongings and treasures. Children, sitting on carts or in their mothers' arms, look on with bewilderment and anxiety at the surrounding destruction and the chaos of the last moments of their native city. Even the carvings and extraordinary art form often depict scenes from the lives of those prisoners for whom the rulers or authorities commanded to perform music. This is especially evident in cases when they leave their native home forever. Such an episode may also be referenced in ancient literary sources, for example, in the well-known psalm called the Lament of Psalm 47. It tells how many people gathered by the rivers of Babylon, and we, filled with sorrow and nostalgia for our homeland at Zion, sat in despair. On the willows growing along the banks, we hung our harps because our captors, who had taken us captive, demanded that we sing. They puffed up with arrogance and asked us to sing the song of Zion, that very joyful song they wanted to hear. But how could we sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land? This story contains one of the earliest recorded warnings and prophecies addressed to the Assyrian Empire about its future and its inevitable fall. Many enemies of this great power longed for its destruction, knowing that its fate was sealed. In this context, there is mention of the daughter of Babylon, the city destined for destruction. Those who already pray proudly and seek intercession are spoken of. Blessed is he who repays you for what you have done to us. Blessed is he who seizes your infants and dashed them against the rock. These words testify to the mood of retribution and justice for suffering. Following this, the Assyrian army, led by its king, advanced directly toward Jerusalem. The great city under siege was in danger. King Hezekiah, the Judean ruler, did not remain passive and took measures to defend it. He built a new city wall around the town to strengthen the defenses, and with clever engineering solutions, they dug an underground channel, a tunnel through hard rock, to supply the city with fresh water necessary for life.
However, despite all efforts, the situation remained quite alarming and gloomy. King Hezekiah understood that negotiations were unavoidable and was forced to begin dialogue with the enemy.
In the 14th year of his reign, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib started capturing all the fortified cities of Judah, the situation became even more dangerous. At that time, Hezekiah sent a messenger to him in Lachish, hoping to resolve the conflict peacefully, and, according to biblical tradition, he admitted his guilt, expressed readiness to accept deserved punishment, and even agreed to pay a monetary tribute. He had to take gold from the most sacred places, from the magnificent temple and palaces, to ransom peace. This decision was undoubtedly morally difficult and a testament to his piety, as he was sacrificing holiness for salvation. But even these measures did not stop the Assyrian leader, who continued the siege of the city. One day, Sennacherib sent his commander, Rabshakeh, to the walls of Jerusalem with a demand for surrender. Rabshakeh, aiming to demoralize the defenders, reminded them of the misfortunes that had befallen other nations at the hands of the Assyrians. He asked where the gods of the cities of Yama, Arpad, Sepharvaim, or Yen, who among them was able to protect their people. Where were their gods when their cities fell? He also reminded them that Samaria, the main fortress of Israel, had not withstood the sword of the Assyrians. Its gods did not save it. All hope seemed lost, and it appeared that the victory of the enemy was inevitable. However, exactly at this critical moment, fate began turning the situation toward a more favorable outcome. The Book of Chronicles and the account of these events tell that King Hezekiah, enduring severe trials, turned to his God, Yahweh, praying for deliverance. A firm faith in a miracle was born within his heart. Poets and historians, writing about these events, recorded that in response, the Lord sent a message of prophecy from heaven. It said, "Behold, I will do this." Yes, destruction and desolation will engulf the fortified cities. Their inhabitants will turn into field grasses and greenery, like grass on the rooftops that quickly disappears. It also speaks of what will follow, like wheat that was previously burned so that it would not ripen. This omen predicts the future about the Assyrian king who shall not enter or capture the city. The Lord promises that he will not approach Jerusalem with military force or shield, and that the fortified city will remain impregnable. During the time of a terrible siege, despite threats and dangers, the fate of the city and its people continued to depend on the divine providence and God's will. It was in this manner that the arduous struggle for survival and faith in the one true God was ultimately resolved. On that fateful night, a heavenly messenger, the angel of the Lord, appeared and delivered a devastating blow to the Assyrian army, striking 25,000 men in their camp. When dawn broke the following morning and the first rays of sunlight penetrated the dark tents and huts, the soldiers discovered a horrifying sight: they had all perished, leaving behind only silence and dead darkness. To this day, we cannot with certainty determine what exactly caused such a sudden and terrible annihilation of the army, which seemed to vanish as if predestined overnight. However, it is believed that a powerful outbreak of plague, one of the most deadly diseases of that time, played a key role in this tragic event. For a long period, plague had posed a serious threat to any military force caught in an epidemic. This was not the first occasion when such a disease entirely or partially destroyed an army. Historical evidence confirms that infections could spread rapidly among soldiers, undermining their strength and causing the death of even the most prepared warriors. One such example is an ancient Egyptian account, which, as later recalled by the historian Herodotus, describes how the Assyrian army was forced to retreat in complete confusion. The story mentions that during the campaign, the enemy suffered a misfortune: field mice attacked their camp, damaging essential equipment such as shields and spear shafts. This led to the Assyrian soldiers losing the ability to continue fighting, rendering them incapable of combat and forcing them to retreat. Perhaps, such a description, even with a hint of the unusual, illustrates the extraordinary outbreak of plague that could wipe out an entire army overnight. Simultaneously, sources from the Syrian side, as expected, avoid mentioning such a humiliating event and likely conceal the true cause of their defeat to preserve their honor and dignity before their people. The only recorded source recounting these events briefly mentions the early successes of the Assyrians and the gifts brought to them by King Hezekiah, a clear sign of their military superiority and power. This brief account does not reveal the full extent of the weapons and strategies employed by the Assyrian army, and to other enemies, it rather serves as a reminder of their colossal strength, which had to be challenged. Nonetheless, despite initial victories and strength, this military campaign ended in failure and defeat for the Assyrians. Perhaps, this defeat served as a catalyst for the southern city of Babylon, which was eager to free itself from the rule of the Assyrian Empire and to preserve its independence. The question of Babylon's fate was one of the most important and pressing issues for the Assyrian rulers, as this majestic and ancient city was renowned for its unique culture, rich history, and significant influence. Its preservation within the empire was an extremely challenging task requiring constant effort. Various Assyrian rulers made numerous attempts to resolve this issue, seeking ways to strengthen their control over Babylon or eliminate the threat of its independence. One such approach was granting the local Babylonian monarch the right to govern the city and surrounding lands, which was sometimes perceived by the populace as a form of concession and a means to maintain relative stability. However, such measures often led to unintended consequences. As soon as central authority of the Assyrian Empire was distracted by other matters, the local king would declare his independence again, quickly sparking new conflicts and uprisings. Another common strategy was appointing a vassal from among the Assyrian nobles as governor of Babylon, which in theory was meant to reinforce control over the city, yet, in practice, this often worsened the situation. Revolts and discontent among the Babylonians found expression in attempts to overthrow the appointed foreign ruler, frequently through conspiracies and rebellions.
As a result, these power changes often rapidly destabilized political stability.
Finally, the third method, passing the throne of Babylon to members of the royal family, also presented difficulties. Usually, this meant that a brother or uncle of the Assyrian king occupied the Babylonian throne, hoping to retain power and strengthen family ties. Nonetheless, even this strategy was fraught with danger. An ambitious relative placed on the throne of Babylon could seek to leverage the city's wealth and power as a springboard to overthrow or assassinate the Assyrian king, greatly complicating the task of maintaining the unity of the empire. For example, by 694 BCE, King Sennacherib felt that his persistent efforts to reunify the empire had become a personal and heavy burden. He was tired of endless conflicts and believed that further struggles would only worsen the situation. In this context, it is important to note that the Babylonian rebels, only partially, perhaps, were responsible for the death of one of his sons, which can be considered one of the consequences of the complex and difficult relationship between this powerful eastern city and the Assyrian ruler. Looking back on his victories in the north, in the kingdom of Judah, as well as along the Mediterranean coast, where he confidently defeated his enemies, King Sennacherib decided to undertake a decisive campaign to finally put an end to the Babylonian problem. In 689 BCE, an Assyrian military commander laid siege to the mighty and ancient city of Babylon. The blockade lasted for 15 whole months, and only after the city's defenders surrendered did Sennacherib, relying on historical chronicles, leave a detailed account of the events that took place. In this description, he proudly and without any restraint reported that he had destroyed the city and demolished its homes, starting from the foundations and up to the rooftops. "Every structure, every building," he said, "I stripped and set on fire. I broke and sluiced the brick and clay walls into the Aractic Canal, doing the same with the temples, the sacred ziggurats, and both their inner and outer parts." As a testament to the complete eradication of cultural heritage, he emphasized that he dumped the ruins into the canal, diverting the water throughout the city's surface, flooding it completely and turning it into an invisible water space on the surface, from which he hoped nothing would rise again. Sennacherib claimed that he destroyed Babylon so thoroughly that its city square and buildings were obliterated as if it had never existed, so much so that, according to him, in the future no one would be able to recognize what it looked like or where its sanctuaries and temples were located. He entirely absorbed Babylon into a flood of water, transforming its space into a flooded swamp. This, he said, was such a harsh punishment that even by the standards of that time, such destruction appeared excessively brutal. Burning down a Jewish or Philistine city to the ground might still be understandable, but doing the same to an ancient and wealthy cultural and religious center, the capital of Babylon, was truly too much. As a result of this destruction, a wave of loud judgments and condemnations arose in Assyria. Sennacherib felt the need to respond, and he seized Babylon's god Marduk, transferred him back to Nineveh, and handed him over for judgment. One can only imagine the scene: a group of Assyrian officials gathered in the sacred court to deliver judgment over the silent stone statue, the divine symbol. The outcome of this trial was that Marduk was found guilty, although surviving fragments of the texts do not provide a precise account of the verdict. Sennacherib's primary goal was the complete destruction of Babylon and its obliteration from history, so that this city would vanish from the face of the earth forever. Indeed, the king set out to erase it from the map of the world, and he achieved this. The northern regions of Babylon were incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, and the city itself was left in ruins. After such destructive battles, Sennacherib's strength, it seems, was exhausted. The years spent in wars and devastation began to show on his weary face and weakened authority. In the years that followed, he no longer seemed to harbor great hopes for new military victories. Instead, he became closer to building something aged, simultaneously enriched with symbols of glory and memory. He settled in Nineveh, the ancient capital that had maintained its importance for centuries but was in decline and in need of restoration by that time. Sennacherib took on the task of restoring the throne, renovating the palaces, and building new ones, adorning them with exquisite reliefs depicting his exploits and victories. Among such victories was the Siege of Lachish, an important episode in his military career, which he often wrote about. According to one of his inscriptions, he constructed a palace from precious materials: ivory, ebony, boxwood, cedar, cypress, juniper, and turpentine. He called this magnificent palace the Palace Without Borders, a symbol of his power and wealth, surpassing the expectations of his contemporaries. Interestingly, his rooms were decorated with cedar beams erected on Mount Amunis, and the doors made of cypress emitted a delicate, sweet aroma, making the palace appear even more impressive. There were 8 lush lion statues facing each other, each cast from 11,400 talents of shining copper. These sculptures created a special bright illumination inside the palace, heightening the sense of grandeur and majesty of this magnificent structure. On one of the inscriptions carved into a stone lion placed in the quarter dedicated to Queen Sennacherib, Tashmacheret, there was a message expressing hope for a long, prosperous, and strong life for her ruler. This brief inscription testified to the reverence that admirers and courtiers paid to their sovereign, wishing her everlasting strength and health during her reign. At the same time, King Sennacherib, eager to adorn his new royal residence, ordered the creation of magnificent gardens near the palace. He brought many different plants and fragrant herbs from the farthest corners of his vast empire, and probably from beyond its borders. It can be assumed that among the plants he brought were cotton trees from India, a distant and mysterious land with a rich flora. Some believe that these gardens could have served as the prototype for the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, considered by many researchers to be a great architectural and engineering achievement. Perhaps these gardens, created within Nineveh, were conceived as a miniature copy of the entire empire, embodying ideas of harmony, beauty, and wealth inherent in Sennacherib's dominion. In his inscriptions, this king describes his gardens and building projects as if aiming to immortalize his era as a time of grand achievements. He speaks of the creation of a botanical garden next to the palace, which became an exact copy of Mount Amunis, a symbol of greatness and natural beauty. This garden gathered all kinds of aromatic plants and fruit trees, symbols of mountain peaks and the wealth of the Chaldean region. They represented a living illustration of the natural palette, which served not only for beauty but also for meditative contemplation. By the end of his reign, Sennacherib likely shone brightly, resembling a city worthy of the mightiest and greatest empire in the world. His transformations, embodied in construction and garden projects, clearly indicated a new direction in his rule, a desire to leave behind a legacy that surpassed all previous eras in richness and cultural significance, an age when Nineveh could boast of its glory and splendor. In this rich and saturated process of change carried out by Sennacherib, we can find an alternative scenario of historical development, more harmonious and peaceful. Previously, he had been a warlike king, demonstrating power by tearing down the walls of Lachish, destroying Babylon completely, and showing ruthlessness in battles. But it seems that later, his views on governance and ideas about the fate of the country changed, and he began to bet not on military exploits but on building and developing the arts. If these changes truly reflected internal shifts in this Assyrian ruler's personality, then the tragedy lay in the fact that he perhaps failed to pass on this renewed spirit to his heirs. Sennacherib had at least 7 sons, each presumably eligible for the throne. However, after the tragic death of his eldest son, the crown prince, in battle against the Elamites, the king faced a difficult choice to determine which of his younger sons would assume royal duties. The situation was complicated by the fact that only 2 contenders remained, Adrammellisu and Esarhaddon. This decision became a true test for Sennacherib, an election on which the future of the state depended. Initially, the eldest son Adrammellisu was considered the heir, but over time, apparently, his position deteriorated, and the king realized that this name no longer inspired trust or favor in him. The reasons for this change in his attitude can only be guessed at, but analysis of the events suggests that the king detected signs of cruelty, coldness, and a thirst for power in the character of his eldest son, which made him fear his potential ability to govern the empire. As a result, Sennacherib decided to make his younger son, Esarhaddon, the next heir, which sparked a vigorous reaction among his brothers and allies. In one of the later texts that have come down to us, Esarhaddon recalls the influence this decision had on them. He recounts that he was the younger brother of his elder, but by the will of the gods, through a special prophecy, his father exalted him in the eyes of the family. The king, consulting the god Samus and Adad through divination, was convinced that his son was worthy of the throne, and based on these divine indications, he gathered the entire community, the people of the entire Assyrian kingdom and his brothers, to officially announce his choice. This news sparked anger and fury among his brothers. Desperate and furious, driven by madness, they maliciously and in a frenzy of rivalry attacked one another like goats, fighting for the right to keep their blood in power. Their passions and thirst for authority led them to extreme actions. Without any sign of divine blessing, they armed themselves with swords and began a fight not for life but for death. This moment became the pinnacle of their madness and treacherous godlessness, igniting a conflict through which they lost their light and trust from the gods. Other brothers attempted to persuade their father to change his decision, but King Sennacherib remained steadfast, resolutely standing his ground. While the elder heirs challenged their father's decree, Adrammellisu, the younger brother, was forced to swear allegiance to his older brother to secure his safety and position. This oath typically took the form of a legal agreement well known to all Assyrian rulers. It spanned many pages and was filled with strict promises of loyalty to the new heir. These documents contained not only commitments of fidelity but also threatened punishments for any violation. The severe threat stipulated that if someone destroyed or mutilated this agreement, setting it on fire, throwing it into water, burying it in the ground, stealing or damaging it, then the celestial goddesses, such as Anna, the queen of gods, would seek death in retaliation. Diseases such as wasting, malaria, insomnia, worries, and ailments, sent from the heavens, would afflict anyone who broke this covenant. May Anna be struck by plague, deprived of the ability to enter the presence of gods and the king, and may such people, like wild animals, wander through the desert. Let Shemaim, the sun, symbol of heaven and earth, blind them and lead them into dark gloom. Let Ishtar, the mistress of battle and war, break their bows in the midst of a fight. Let Kilinda and Tyland, divine entities, turn away from them, and Nabu, the bearer of verdicts and prophecies, wipe their names from the face of the earth and forever destroy their offspring. This terrible oath was sworn in the presence of the great gods of heaven and earth, behind sacred walls, so that no one could violate it, knowing that immediate punishments would follow any breach. Despite such a threatening agreement, enraged and full of hatred, the former crown prince Udru Mulisu refused to accept his father's decision and continued to defy his will. Meanwhile, Shardadin found himself in a very dangerous situation, with his life under threat, and was forced to flee west, far beyond his homeland, to hide from persecution and the perilous conditions in Nineveh. Over time, he could not help but regret what had happened, his exile and the forced abdication. Soon after, malicious rumors, lies, and slander spread like a sinister, persistent wind, manipulated by hostile forces fighting against him. Behind him, unfriendly, treacherous words were regularly spoken, echoing through the streets and causing confusion and distrust among the people. These malicious comments ultimately turned away the hearts and goodwill of his father, even though by nature he was a compassionate and reserved man. However, the king's gaze was constantly fixed on Esarhaddon, his son whom he had raised and valued. Perhaps fleeing Nineveh in some measure saved Esarhaddon from inevitable death and destruction, which could have overtaken him under the previous circumstances. Yet his father, King Sennacherib, was deeply mistaken, unaware of the growing danger threatening his son. On the 20th day of the Tibeto-Assyrian calendar, an event occurred that shook not only the entire region but also history itself: a murder. The crown prince Urdu Mulisu, who disregarded authority and did not revere King Sennacherib sufficiently, attacked the king during his prayer in one of Nineveh's temples and fatally wounded him. This terrible murder caused terror and shock not only within the country but also beyond its borders. In Judah and other places where the Assyrians were disliked, people perhaps welcomed such an event with relief, waiting for change. At the same time, in Assyria itself, the killing of the king was considered an unthinkable crime, contrary to the interests of the entire country and its customs. The culprits, treacherous Urdu Mulisu and his brothers, underestimated how much they would become hated by the people and how quickly public dissatisfaction would turn into rebellion. Exploiting this wave of outrage, the crown prince Esarhaddon swiftly gathered an army around him, hoping to regain power and restore justice. Meanwhile, his brothers, upon learning of the events, also began forming troops, preparing for a possible battle. However, as they approached their first confrontation, many soldiers in their armies, disillusioned and opposed to their leaders, began deserting in large numbers, fearing to fight for those who had so cruelly slain their former king. As a result, the battle that ensued was much less fierce than the enemies expected, since a significant part of the troops ceased resistance and fled. Unfaced with serious opposition, Esarhaddon continued his march toward the capital, Nineveh, to claim the throne and establish his legal rights. His campaign, though full of confidence, was primarily driven by a sense of duty to defend the law and the honor of his people, as well as to justly restore order that had been shattered by the bloody usurpation. In one of his later inscriptions, he described in detail his feelings and emotions when he stepped again onto the land of the city where his father had once been murdered. Returning to his native city, he entered Nineveh with trembling and joy, the great and glorious city that had once been his royal home. Feeling fully entitled to the throne as the heir, he took his rightful place upon the exemplary royal seat, the very same throne that belonged to his father. At that moment, he felt the southern wind, known as the breath of Ea, gentle and favorable to the king's rule, softly and confidently guiding him. From the heavens and the earth, good omens, prophecies, and messages from the gods and goddesses descended easily and clearly into his heart and soul, instilling bravery and confidence in his actions. His entire nature was filled with resolve and strength, for Sarchedon was full of rage and a thirst for justice against those who plotted his destruction. That is why he immediately took measures to punish all those involved in the conspiracy, especially the family of those who had attempted to overthrow his authority. One of his ominous inscriptions states, "I found each of the guilty soldiers who unjustly incited my brothers to seize power over Assyria, and I punished them brutally. I destroyed their offspring." Through these actions, he was able to restore his power and reclaim his rightful place on the throne left to him by his father. However, the manner in which he was forced to assume this position left a deep mark on his heart and soul. Deeply distressed and suffering internally, he spent the rest of his life in an atmosphere of constant paranoia, in endless fears and suspicion. He could never fully trust anyone, neither close aides nor his companions. In his letters, written on clay tablets, he often consulted oracles and priests, asking whether any of his relatives or officials conspired to harm or betray him. Most of the time, he stayed in the well-fortified palace of his city, protected by massive walls, surrounded by only one entrance and one exit, making it virtually an impregnable fortress. Perhaps fearing the wrath of the gods and their possible punishing hands, Esarhaddon also sought to establish good relations with the southern capital, Babylon, which had once been destroyed by his martial father, King Sennacherib. He ordered the statues of Babylonian gods to be returned to their sacred places and, in the 12th century BCE, announced plans to restore the ancient, once famous city of Babylon. Many letters written by King Esarhaddon himself and his chief architects have survived. From these documents, it is clear that he sincerely desired peace and prosperity, was striving for creation and restoration. His goal was to rebuild Babylon as it was before the destructions, to bring it back to its former glory. He said, "I laid the foundation of a new platform, based on its old, proven, and reliable foundations, strictly adhering to the original architectural plan." He emphasized that he made no slight modifications, not a single bit and not half a centimeter, for each change could disrupt the harmony. Exactly as he intended, he recreated the grand city by restoring its structure according to ancient plans. His construction was so solid that it resembled a fortress atop the most powerful mountain, and the city's layout was similar to what had existed in the days of his ancestors. The rebuilding of Babylon undertaken by Ashurbanipal sent a clear and strong signal to his people. The Babylonians expressed their gratitude for the work done, evidenced by many letters and appeals that have come down to us. A particularly impressive letter was written by the city governor, who detailed the feelings and thoughts that filled the inhabitants. In this message, it was stated that when the king entered Babylon, the people welcomed him with joy, and each day they blessed the king for restoring their glory and wealth. The people called him the figure who rebuilt and revived the city, restoring its former splendor. The allies and leaders of the Chaldeans, living both at the mouth of the sea and along its shores, praised and glorified the king, assuring that he had accomplished the impossible. He restored Babylon and raised it from the ruins. However, amidst this fame and honor, Ashurbanipal became famous not only as a great builder and restorer but also as a military strategist. He was unafraid to take military steps, and one of his boldest decisions was an expedition to Egypt, a result of fatigue from supporting rebellious elements in his lands and a desire to put an end to threats prompted him to take this risky but necessary action. His first campaign, beginning in 373 BCE, ended in complete failure. However, within 2 years, he succeeded in a subsequent assault, significantly boosting his authority and strengthening his position. In victory, a grand monument was erected in the south of what is now Turkey, celebrating his triumph. In its inscriptions, a tone of celebration echoed, "Mems, this is a city I, the king, can only speak of with pride. In half a day, I changed bridges, dug tunnels, stormed fortifications, and as a result, I besieged, captured, destroyed, plundered, and burned this city to the ground." At the same time, Ashurbanipal's health began to noticeably decline. The exact disease that troubled him remains unclear, but some believe he suffered from one of the earliest known cases of depression in history. His eyelids drooped, and he increasingly spent days in secluded solitude, avoiding food, water, and even communication with his loved ones and associates. His condition worsened after the death of the queen Her, who was his sole love and support in life. At that moment, Ashurbanipal began corresponding desperately with his chief exorcist, a man named Adat Shumusir, responsible for the king's health and well-being. In his letters, he wrote with anxiety and a genuine sense of despair, "What has happened to you, my king, to your spirit? Why do you still remain so immersed in despair over this young soul? If there were even the slightest means to cure him, you would not have hesitated to give up half your kingdom to bring him back to life. But what else can we do but seek a way out? Oh, my benefactor, are you not made from those spirits who can be healed and saved? From the Assyrian court, there are harsh and detailed accounts of Esarhaddon's condition, describing him as a person suffering from persistent vomiting, fever that led to exhaustion, nosebleeds, dizziness, painful earaches, and intense melancholia. The king often feared that his fate was near its end, and a terrible rash appeared on most of his body, including his face. His doctors, experienced specialists, tried unsuccessfully many times to help their burdened ruler, and their desperation was evident in their letters to him. Several times, the king asked me why I could not make an accurate diagnosis and prescribe proper treatment. Despite my efforts and consultations, it was impossible to understand the true nature of his ailment. As Esarhaddon's inevitable death approached, the question of an heir arose, and he himself realized that without a wise and sober decision, the future of the empire was at risk. To prevent the possible disintegration of the state, he devised a bold and very unusual plan. According to it, one of his younger sons was to become the king of Assyria and rule from Nineveh, the seat of power. Another was to govern Babylon, swearing loyalty to the Assyrian throne.
In Babylon, he entrusted the kingdom to his eldest surviving son Shamash-Shumukin, and in Nineveh, to ensure control over the entire empire, he appointed his younger son Ashurbanipal.
This plan struck him as brilliant. Two brothers ruling the two greatest cities in the world, united by a single line of authority, such were his hopes, would lay the foundation for a new renaissance, a new era of peace and prosperity. However, as often happens with great schemes, its implementation proved to be flawed. Ultimately, his decision became the seat of conflicts and wars that shattered the empire's strength and ushered Assyrian civilization into its decline, marking the most tragic period of its history. Once, in the distant 6th century BCE, in the city of Haran, located in northern Mesopotamia, an extraordinary scene took place that later became the subject of many legends and historical descriptions. In that city, a woman suddenly fell into a trance and began speaking in an unknown, foreign language. Her movements and speech drew the attention of the townspeople because she wandered the streets, shouting prophetic words that were simultaneously clear and unambiguous, like messengers of fate. The gaze of passing strangers and later local witnesses recorded that this extraordinary scene was not a random event but carried a special prophetic significance. From this episode, the inhabitants of the city and its surroundings drew their first conclusions about upcoming events, and among them, the most prominent was the message about an impending disaster. A local woman from the outskirts of Haran named Belawujara noticed the event and, struck by what she saw, hurriedly reported a prophecy concerning her contemporaries and, in particular, a man named Nusku. She predicted that King Sennacherib would be destroyed, and something terrible would happen to his name and descendants. Soon, this news spread through the surrounding areas and reached the far corners of the empire. Rumors quickly circulated, and warnings of an impending catastrophe reached the ears of Esarhaddon, the ruler of a mighty and power-hungry empire. His spies, scattered across the kingdom, carefully relayed this unusual prophecy to him, and the king was deeply affected by this alarming news. In response, he immediately issued strict orders to suppress any spreading of such rumors and to punish anyone caught conspiring related to this plot. To do so, he ordered the houses and possessions of suspects to be burned, aiming to curb the growth of potential danger and to restore agitation and fear among the population. However, despite all measures taken, the rumors of the prophecy had already spread widely, making them impossible to contain. Witnesses from street stories and burning eyes indicated that the message of the impending disaster had reached considerable proportions. In the final years of his reign, Esarhaddon grew increasingly suspicious and prone to foreboding disasters. He felt possessed by a certain obsession with omens and prophecies that kept him restless both day and night. His court astrologers, wise and skillful men, dedicated much time trying to calm his fears and predict the future using stars and celestial phenomena. One of their letters, preserved to this day, describes how a lunar eclipse moved from the eastern parts of the sky to the western regions, and how, with the precision characteristic only of royal astrologers, it reached its peak, creating the impression that the entire western world was plunged into shadow. At that moment, a noticeable congregation of planets was observed, among which Jupiter and Venus held special prominence. The astrologers considered this a good sign, foretelling not only luck for the king but also, as they hoped, protection from evil spirits and prospects for victory. Fearing upcoming disasters, Esarhaddon decided to resort to an unusual and highly complex ritual called the King's Substitute. Its essence was that the king himself would hide for a certain period, and his place would be temporarily occupied by another person, an ordinary individual chosen specifically for this purpose. Usually, this person was a close relative or a trusted confidant, but sometimes, a matter of chance, a complete outsider who would live as king for the designated period. For approximately 100 days, this person would reside in the palace, wear a crown and royal robes, eat the king's food, and sleep in his bed. During this period, the true king hid somewhere in secret and did not appear in public so that malicious spiritual forces capable of harming the monarch could not find him. In recent years of his reign, Ashur-Hadan increasingly resorted to this ritual because he felt the approach of the end and the danger looming over him.
He feared the predicted prophecies of his imminent death and, in order to deceive fate, devised a substitute that could temporarily mask the true identity of the monarch.
In this context, he began performing the same complex ritual every 100 days. During these times, he took on the guise of a simple farmer, hoping to distract evil spirits from his soul and avoid death. Throughout the 100 days, he remained in hiding, while his stand-in, an ordinary man, lived in luxury and behaved as a king. When the period ended and presumably all negative energy directed at the real ruler had been absorbed, the stand-in died, and the true king returned to the throne, saved from dark forces. Ashur-Hadan repeatedly performed this ritual, doing it 3 times in a row, which testified to his despair and intense personal anxiety. He tried in every possible way to prolong his life and ward off the impending doom, but despite his efforts, his fate proved unavoidable. When a rebellion arose in Egypt, the king set out to quell the uprising. During this military campaign, his health suddenly deteriorated, and the disease progressed so rapidly that he became critically ill as his army crossed the northern borders of Mesopotamia. Ultimately, he died shortly thereafter in the city of Haran. It was in this city that, several years earlier, a woman exclaimed in delight while running through narrow, dusty streets about a prophecy of her death, that it was here that the prophecies about his destiny would come true. After Ashur-Hadan's death, his sons Ashurbanipal and Shamash-Mumukin ascended the throne, first in Assyria, then in Babylon, consolidating their power and beginning a joint rule. This hereditary reign immediately marked a period of notable successes because it continued the course set by their father, bringing glory and strength to their mighty state, and leading to new heights for the powerful empire. Shamash-Mumukin traveled to Babylon and brought back a statue of Marduk, the last valuable artifact necessary for his return to his homeland. Meanwhile, the 2 princes easily took their thrones, and it seemed that the old king's plans would soon be realized, ushering in a new era of peace and stability. At first, everything indeed pointed to the fulfillment of the plan and the long-awaited prosperity. However, for various reasons, this period of peace was short-lived. It can be firmly stated that the reign of Ashur-bal-apnipal is still considered the golden age of the Assyrian Empire. It was during his era that the state's territory reached its maximum extent, previously unattainable by any of the peoples of the world. And the capital, Nineveh, grew rapidly and was considered the largest city on the planet. The very king, Ashurbanipal, appears to contemporaries and historians as a wise and versatile ruler, full of concern for his people, their well-being, and future affairs. Of particular interest is the fact that among his numerous virtues, one can highlight his ability to read, a rare quality for rulers of that time. In the era of ancient giants, reading was mostly a privilege of servants or scribes who carried out written assignments for kings. Those in the upper echelons of power typically engaged in military campaigns and hunting, considering these pursuits more noble and masculine. However, Ashurbanipal apparently did not conform to these stereotypes. Before becoming heir to the throne, he prepared for service in the temples, which involved early training in reading and writing, tasks familiar to priests. He was proud of mastering this most complex art, as reflected in an inscribed record he made himself. In it, he wrote, "I, Ashurbanipal, have attained the wisdom of Nabu, the god of knowledge, and mastered all forms of writing. I have become a master of this art. I have studied the intricate Sumerian signs and mastered the difficult Akkadian language, which has its particular complexity and multiple meanings. I enjoyed reading ancient stone tablets preserved from the era before the Great Flood, works that no other king before me studied. I wrote on clay tablets myself, checked them, compared them, and stored them in my palace for further study and review." This collection of clay tablets, dedicated to the works of Sumashum and his heritage, became a sensation of its time and a symbol of cultural progress. Creating such a rich library, Ashurbanipal aimed to establish a universal archive where all known written monuments would be stored. For this purpose, he sent envoys to cities and educational centers throughout his empire to request copies of clay-written works. As a result of his efforts, over 30,000 clay tablets have been collected, most containing records of observations of natural phenomena and omens, as well as descriptions of the behavior of people and animals. The library also housed dictionaries, translators, and manuals on Sumerian, Akkadian, and other ancient languages, religious texts, ritual guides, fables, prayers, and spells. Among the many collected works were both comic satires and great mythological stories, as well as poetic masterpieces of Mesopotamia. Especially significant is that, thanks to this collection, many of the most famous myths and legends, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, have been preserved almost entirely to this day, primarily thanks to Ashurbanipal's diligence and foresight. It is this wealth of knowledge that has reached future generations through his efforts and initiatives to systematically gather literary and scientific monuments. However, this commendable and progressive stage in the empire's history was soon undermined by serious challenges threatening its existence and security. Egypt, the youngest of the imperial territories, was in a state of prolonged rebellion and internal instability. In the 18th year BC, at the command of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, his troops marched south with the aim of suppressing uprisings and restoring control over this strategically vital region. In the classic style of Assyrian conquests, the army advanced rapidly, destroying numerous Egyptian cities and crushing pockets of resistance with relentless force. This military expedition undoubtedly achieved temporary success and managed to quell the rebellion. However, it also intensified the dissatisfaction of the local inhabitants, and resistance continued to grow stronger. By the following year, new rebellions and uprisings erupted, forcing Ashurbanipal to return to Egypt for renewed military action, now in a more decisive and uncompromising manner. Despite all his efforts and the appearances of victory with each new campaign, the final integration of Egypt into the Assyrian Empire was never fully realized. At the same time, on another distant edge of the empire, a serious new challenge was emerging: the Elamite tribes located in the south of modern Iran. These peoples were known for their ancient history and played a significant role in the destruction of Sumerian civilization over 1,000 years earlier. Since then, they had established a powerful and wealthy kingdom centered in Susa, which gradually strengthened and became a major political force in the region. The Elamites repeatedly clashed with the Assyrians, and their confrontations left a mark in history. Their border roughly coincided with the current borders between Iraq and Iran. Ashurbanipal's father, a man named Palar-Haddon, vainly attempted to maintain peaceful coexistence with the Elamite people. He even tolerated incidents at the borders and did not always take measures to stop acts of violence. Internally, the situation within Elam gradually grew more complicated. The people became increasingly confident in their strength and their ability to resist Assyrian dominance. Unable to win the war through open combat, the Elamites, like the Egyptians, decided to pursue a strategy of supporting and arming insurgent groups within Assyrian territory, creating troublesome problems for the empire's authorities without escalating to full-scale war. However, in 653 BC, the king of Elam most likely decided to shift to a more active phase of confrontation. At that time, one of their representatives named Timon received an important secret message addressed to Shamash-Ukin, the elder brother of King Ashurbanipal, who at that time ruled as king of Babylon by virtue of their shared father. Shamashu, who had long felt internal dissatisfaction and discontent with his fate, perceived his role more as mediocre and limited. After their father's death 13 years ago, he took the throne of Babylon, while his brother, Ashurbanipal, headed the Assyrian Empire. Despite his formal authority, Shamashu felt that his influence and power were insufficient for real control. Through inscriptions and records, it is known that he often received orders from his brother and also faced interference from the Assyrian ruler in Babylonian affairs. His inner discontent grew, and he yearned for change. It was probably this dissatisfaction that prompted him to send a secret message to Timon, in which he seemingly offered support for preparations of a military kidnapping and overthrow of Ashurbanipal. In response to these hostile intentions, Shamashu proposed an agreement to the Elamite king. He promised to provide all necessary assistance in combating Assyrian dominance if Elam allowed him to become the rightful and sole ruler of Babylon. Considering their long history of opposition and seeking to strengthen their position, the Elamites gladly accepted this proposal. When the new military season began, the Elamite troops launched a surprising and sudden attack, descending from the mountains to strike at the southern borders of the Assyrian Empire, inflicting defeats and creating additional problems for those who had taken power in Babylon. Shurahbanel, feeling true anger and hatred towards his enemies, was furious. He quickly gathered his forces and led them along the rivers, rapidly approaching the battlefield where his opponents, the Elamites, were assembling. In a brutal confrontation, he successfully repelled their assault and drove their troops back into Elam. In the battle on the bank of the Uli River, near their capital Susa, the commander achieved a decisive victory, which became a significant event in the history of his state. Numerous inscriptions and commemorative records were made about this event, one of which belongs to Ashurbanipal. They proudly recount the defeat of the enemies and immortalize the details of the tragic battle in carved figures adorning the walls of his palace. The inscriptions state, "By the will of the gods Ahura and Marduk, I flooded the Uli River with their dead bodies and filled the plain of Susa with their corpses, like seaweed floating on the water." Among the achievements, it is also noted that during the battle, the heads of Timon, king of Elam, were cut off on the plain. One magnificent carved figure depicts Ashurbanipal himself resting in the gardens of his palace. He is shown surrounded by the queen, musicians, and servants bringing him drinks and dishes so he can enjoy well-deserved rest. At the same time, a head of his defeated enemy, Timon, hung from a tree branch, serving as a reminder of the recent victory and fierce battle. During this victorious campaign, it is unclear whether Ashurbanipal himself realized that his brother might be involved in an even more unexpected and dangerous attack. However, about a year later, his brother Shamash Shumukin made it clear that he had his own true intentions. He rebelled against his own brother, raising troops and confronting him, declaring independence for the land of Babylonia. This news deeply shook Ashurbanipal and became a serious challenge to his authority. In his official records, a mixture of pain and anger caused by the brother's betrayal is quite evident. In his writings, he noted, "Shamash Shumukin is my unfaithful brother, before whom I have done many good deeds and whom I appointed as king of Babylon." He reminded that it was for this brother that he gathered and provided all necessary resources, soldiers, horses, and chariots. Major cities, wealth, gardens, lands, and thousands of trusted people were at his disposal, all gifts from his own generosity and power. But despite this, his brother, forgetting kindness and justice, constantly sought pretexts for evil schemes, treacherously betraying his trust. Outwardly, Shamash Shumukin spoke of friendship and harmony. Inwardly, he plotted villainy, planned treachery, and aimed to seize power. He knew how to manipulate the Babylonians, who remained loyal to Assyria and Ashurbanipal. These people believed in the sincerity of their ruler, but his enemy lied and created false impressions of friendly intentions. At the same time, Ashurbanipal was filled with horror and anxiety. He often consulted his oracles and seers, asking questions to understand what awaited him and his realm. These questions betrayed doubts and uncertainty that accompanied him during this intensely difficult period. It soon became clear that the Elamite army, still reeling from its previous defeat, decided to seize the opportunity and support the rebellious brother to overthrow Ashurbanipal. Shamash Shumukin also joined this alliance, driven by the pursuit of power. In response, the Assyrian king gathered his forces, mobilized troops, and marched toward the walls of Babylon. He was forced to leave his armies and retreat behind the mighty and impregnable city walls, beginning a siege. The siege lasted for long years, during which a real tragedy unfolded inside and outside the city walls. People, trapped in a hopeless blockade, began suffering from hunger and deprivation. Under conditions of acute food and water shortages, many were forced to resort to the terrible cannibalism in order to survive. When finally the defenses collapsed and the city fell, and Syrian troops broke through the ruined walls, the events took on dramatic and tragic proportions. Shamash Shumukin, apparently, perished in the ruins in fire, and the reasons for his strange start and ending remain unclear to this day. The inscriptions of Ashurbanipal describe how the long-standing inhabitants, suffering terrible torment, were destroyed along with the surviving citizens lying beneath the onslaught of the Assyrian soldiers. Those fortunate enough to escape death by the deadly iron blade, starvation, and other dreadful tortures were forced to seek refuge in the most unexpected and dangerous places. Their paths led through destruction, darkness, and the abyss, and fate demanded urgent searches for shelter to escape death. The power of the great Ashurbanipal, the king driven by uncontrollable rage and unawareness of mercy, proved to be an indestructible and ruthless instrument of retribution. This king relentlessly pursued his enemies, showing no regard for feelings or weaknesses, and shattered their hopes into dust. He left his enemies no chance for salvation, no opportunity to flee, hide, or conceal themselves. Those who defiled the sacred name of his god Ashur, uttered disrespectful words, or conspired against him, all these violators he punished harshly. He deprived them of their tongues so they could not speak his name aloud, and turned them into slaves or rebellious shackles, forcing them to kneel in proud humiliation. Those who survived he subjected to complete annihilation, torturing their bodies and transforming them into victims of bloody spectacles fed to the cruel packs of dogs and pigs, as well as wolves, eagles, and other predatory birds hunting destructively in the air. Their desecrated, mutilated bodies, unrecognizable, he threw into the mouths of disgusting creatures to become part of the savage and merciless ecological circle. After his father Ashur-dan restored the ruins and rebuilt Babylon in the mind of the usurper, Ashurbanipal returned once again to his destructive actions, ultimately wiping the city from the face of the earth and completing his revenge in the name of the Lord he revered.
As the king of the entire Assyrian Empire, Ashurbanipal focused his attention on the Syrian city of Elam.
In the subsequent years, he ascended to the mountains to continue his campaign. But this time, his intentions went beyond ordinary punishment for disobedience. He launched a large-scale war aimed at the complete destruction of Elam as an independent political and cultural entity. During the fierce campaign, he united forces and defeated numerous armies of the Elamites, advancing across their lands with relentless and brutal assault. In historical sources, the image of the city Susa, Shush, has been preserved on Assyrian reliefs as depicted this city with its massive walls. In the distance, plumes of thick flames erupting from gate towers can be seen, indicating total destruction. In the foreground, the inhabitants of the Assyrian army, soldiers rushing to carry off the spoils gathered from the ruins, a diverse wealth, jewelry, silver, gold, and truly priceless valuables. Meanwhile, on the walls and towers of Susa, other soldiers, with gleaming brick walls, were destroying all architectural structures, breaking stones and demolishing palaces. Ashurbanipal himself described the scale of the destruction he ordered in his inscriptions. I captured Susa, the great sacred city, the abode of their gods, the treasury of their secret riches. I entered its palaces and opened the treasuries where silver, gold, goods, and jewelry lay. I destroyed the ziggurat of Susa, shattered the gleaming copper horns that crowned its towers. I looted the temples of Elam, scattering their gods to the wind. I desecrated the tombs of ancient and modern rulers, exposing their remains to the sun and casting them onto the ground of Ashur. I depopulated the provinces of this region, sowing salt there to destroy all future fertility. As a result, these destructions remained forever a monument to the victory of the Assyrians. Their army is an invincible force, and all trials have been overcome.
Then one of their ancient enemies finally fell.
The empire reached the height of its power, and it seemed that nothing could destroy it. However, as is well known, just over 30 years later, in approximately 640 BC, this mighty state found itself on the verge of extinction, leaving behind only smoldering ruins and a civilization that had once prospered, now buried in desert sands. In the final years of his reign, probably around 640 BC, Ashurbanipal took an important and symbolic action. He commissioned the creation of an artwork which, according to historians, was meant to become an eternal legacy of his era and a symbol of the might of the Assyrian civilization. Among these monuments, especially prominent were the reliefs depicting lion hunts, located in the northwest palace of the city of Nineveh. At that time, lions, known as Asiatic lions, roamed widely across the Middle East. These animals were much smaller than their African counterparts, characterized by short manes and distinctive skin folds that gave them a peculiar appearance. Today, we regard these lions as an endangered species requiring special attention for protection and preservation. In Ashurbanipal's time, however, such creatures were an integral part of everyday life, as their presence was often perceived as dangerous and threatening. These powerful predators descended from hills and rocks to steal sheep and livestock, posing a deadly threat to people living in the vicinity. One of the ancient letters, written in panic by a servant to his master who was away on official duties, vividly illustrates the level of alarm and danger that could have come from such lions, their ferocity, and unpredictability. Convey to my master that his servant Yakamadu sends him a message from me. Some time ago, I wrote to my lord informing him that a young lion had been caught in the attic of his house. I asked him to give instructions whether to leave this lion in the attic during his absence or to bring it to the master so he could decide himself. However, letters from my master arrived very slowly, and during the exactly 5 days that passed, the lion remained locked on the attic. During this time, I was advised to feed the lion dog meat, and sometimes even pig meat, but he continued to refuse to eat and showed strong distrust of the offered food. I was worried about the animal's condition, concerned that his prolonged confinement might harm him or that he might fall ill. Internally, I feared for his health, but at some point, I had to take a decisive step. Carefully, I placed the lion into a wooden cage and traveled by boat with him to my master. This action became a necessity for me. Even in ancient times, Assyrian kings regularly hunted lions, and the beasts they killed became symbols of their strength and authority. For Assyrian kings, the lion symbolized everything dangerous and terrifying threatening their people. Defeating this mighty creature meant demonstrating one's strength as well as the ability to protect one's subjects from numerous external threats and dangers. In ancient times, people often went into remote and wild mountainous regions, where lions lived, to try to find and confront them in combat. Gradually, with the development of empires and more complex society, lions from the wild mountain regions began to be gathered in rural settlements, kept in enclosures, and later transported to the capitals.
Such practices are described in the famous inscriptions of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, dating to the 1st millennium BC.
In them, he writes, "With my outstretched hand and fierce heart, I captured 15 strong and formidable lions from the mountains and forests. I also took 50 lion cubs and confined them in pens and cages within the palaces of my great land. I raised them for entertainment, for hunting, which became a spectacle for the people." From time to time, public events were held where hunters and royal warriors demonstrated their strength under the supervision of city residents. The reliefs of that era's art depict scenes of lion hunts, a king in a chariot fighting lions with spear in bow, as well as lions in cages, and nearby, a small person or child, tasked with opening the gates to release the animals into the arena. Surrounding them are soldiers driving the lions with shields and spears, along with trained dogs on leashes helping to capture them. One can imagine the chariots of kings racing across the arena, kicking up dust and creating noise, while arrows whistled through the air, hitting their targets. All these scenes were depicted with remarkable realism by Assyrian artists capable of capturing details with extraordinary precision. The images show human figures dressed in rich clothing, chariots, and even tiny details, nails, eyelashes, all almost alive and as close to reality as possible.
However, although the human figures are depicted with minimal expression, the lions on the reliefs possess almost human-like emotionality. When arrows or spears strike lions, their faces seem to shout about human grief and suffering, deserving of compassion and understanding. For the modern viewer, these images reveal the inner world of those people, their feelings, fears, and pride evoked by great competitions. Unfortunately, by the end of its existence, the Assyrian Empire was experiencing a period of decline. In its final years, it suffered serious defeats and lost its former power. These magnificent works of art became one of the last vivid manifestations of culture during the final collapse of the empire. Less than 30 years later, Assyria fell. Its beautiful cities were suddenly abandoned, buried under layers of sand and time. The causes of these events were numerous: internal contradictions, external invasions, and the difficulties associated with governing a vast empire. Yet even at this moment, these remnants of cultural heritage leave a profound mark in the history of ancient civilizations and serve as a reminder of the former strength and craftsmanship of its people. Recent scientific studies indicate that one of the key factors driving significant historical climate changes was a sudden and noticeable jump in temperature and precipitation, leading to substantial environmental transformations. Thus, in southern Mesopotamia, then located near Babylon, the land gradually turned into a barren wasteland. Rivers and marshy areas became the main and often the only sources of moisture supporting settlements and agriculture. In contrast, in the north, the winter period brought moderate and stable rainfall, greatly reducing the need for artificial irrigation. In this region, seasonal rains typically provided sufficient water for crops, ensuring prosperity and stability in agriculture for a long time. However, over the past 200 years, the climate has begun to undergo noticeable changes, clearly documented in scientific observations. This dynamic was especially pronounced in northern Iraq, where an unusually large amount of precipitation had long been recorded, inspiring assumptions of favorable climatic conditions in the region.
However, recent studies based on the examination of stalagmites found in the caves of Kunaba, which served as ecological repositories, showed that the situation changed around 1 CE, during the final years of Assyrian king Ashurbanipal's reign. Stalagmites are natural formations created by the slow accumulation of mineral deposits from water drops trickling from cave ceilings. These formations resemble tree rings, with each layer reflecting the climate conditions at the time of its formation. Chemical analysis of these rings has allowed scientists to reconstruct the history of climate change, enabling us to trace how the climate evolved throughout the entire period of their development. In particular, the study of stalagmites in the caves of Kunaba provided grounds to distinguish two clearly different phases in the climate history of the Assyrian period. The first of these turned out to be one of the rainiest periods of the last 4,000 years, as evidenced by the stalactites formed during this time. During this brief interval, the land of Assyria was abundant with barley and wheat, and the pastures generously fed numerous herds of sheep, goats, and cattle. This rich vegetation contributed to the prosperity of the economy and ensured the stable existence of the population. However, around 725 BCE, just before the ascent of Shalmaneser V to the throne, this favorable phase came to an end, giving way to a new, harsher climatic period. The second phase was characterized by increasing drought, which gradually developed into a large-scale and prolonged natural catastrophe affecting the entire region. Subsequently, the entire area came under the influence of arid conditions, and modern agriculture in northern Iraq, utilizing contemporary technologies, remains highly sensitive to even minor changes in precipitation. The severe and prolonged drought likely weakened the mighty Assyrian Empire. The dominance of arid conditions was associated with the necessity of excavating water channels and irrigation systems, primarily found in the drier southern regions, which indicates that rainfall was unreliable and unpredictable. Despite this, historical sources virtually do not mention large-scale destructive droughts, suggesting that the population and rulers learned to adapt to these new conditions. Ultimately, the Assyrians developed methods to combat drought, allowing them to maintain stability in food supply and the economy. Documents from that time show that grain and slave prices remained relatively stable, and the population did not suffer from famine or mass deaths in the streets. At the same time, it should be noted that even under such conditions, Assyria faced certain environmental pressures and, ultimately, found itself in a situation where economic benefits and military strength gradually declined compared to neighboring states to the south. The question arises, could this natural pressure have been one of the main factors predetermining their fall? And this topic continues to be a subject of heated debate among historians and scholars. However, in my opinion, there is a different, more significant explanation, that Assyria, almost without exaggeration, was the first truly powerful military state in history, possessing the strongest army in the region, capable of destroying any resistance from its enemies and conquering new territories. Nevertheless, their harsh policies, aimed at unwaveringly maintaining power, made them extremely unpopular among the local inhabitants living in those lands. Constant pressure, brutal measures, and a relentless pursuit of control caused deep discontent among the population and sometimes led to outbreaks of unrest, which frequently erupted into open rebellion. During such times, the Assyrians used all their military strength and repressive methods to quell the uprisings, employing every resource at their disposal. However, the brutality with which they dealt with the rebels often only intensified hostility towards their rule, making their reign increasingly unpopular and fueling growing discontent among the subjects. Eventually, the Assyrians had no choice but to revert to the long-standing practice of resorting to harsh measures justified by the need to suppress resistance. Thus, Ashur was transformed into Elamite lands, where enemies were mercilessly destroyed in the name of maintaining order, to prevent them from posing any further threat. But as is known, nature abhors a void. Beyond the scarlet and smoke-covered lands of Elam, where the last pockets of resistance had just been silenced, a new force had been accumulating over the centuries, awaiting its moment to expand the territories captured by the Assyrians. This force was the Medians, or Medyen, an ancient Iranian tribe that spoke Median and inhabited extensive regions of the north and west Iran. For a long time, their main rivals were the powerful Elamites, who kept their expansion in check. But with the decline of the Elamite Empire's power, these obstacles lost their strength, and the Medians began to advance more actively. Over the following decades, they rapidly expanded their borders, conquering and uniting fragmented and hostile peoples living in what was once Elam under their banners. Gradually, the Medians became a formidable force, united by a common goal and a shared hatred of the Assyrian Empire, which for them symbolized oppression and destruction. All they needed was the right moment to launch large-scale assaults, and this moment came after the death of the great Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, when doubts and weakness gripped the empire. As for Ashurbanipal himself, the last 12 years of his reign remain one of the most mysterious pages in the history of the Assyrian kingdom. The king's name is well documented, his praise in literature and writing is widely known, and his youth and achievements inspire admiration among descendants. However, to the surprise of scholars, almost nothing is known about how he spent his final days, how his last years on the throne unfolded, or how exactly he met his end. It is possible that a serious illness was involved, or perhaps his entire life and rule were overshadowed by prolonged internal conflicts and family disputes, as was the case with his father. Among the preserved historical monuments, there is probably one last inscription that serves as a farewell message and expression of pain and despair, a testament to the internal struggle and suffering of a majestic ruler. This inscription stands out among many other messages from Assyrian kings and is regarded as a sincere reflection of the vulnerability and anguish he experienced in his final hours, addressed to future generations. It states that he behaved righteously towards God and people, cared for the dead and the living, yet somehow, misfortunes and illnesses plagued his fate, causing suffering and distress. He admits that he cannot resolve social conflicts, disagreements within his family, or internal political instability, which in turn evoke anxiety and despair. It seems to him that his mind and body are betraying him simultaneously, disease has fully taken over him. He feels his days fill with sorrow, and even during festivals dedicated to the city deity or significant ceremonies, he perceives himself as unhappy and vulnerable. Death, like a predator, stalks and threatens his life, and thoughts of it disturb him day and night. In the depths of grief and suffering, he continually prays to God for even the wicked to be given a chance to see the light of life. Around 639 BCE, for reasons still largely mysterious and not fully understood, all references to his final days disappear from the chronicles previously containing detailed records of the king's life and reign. At this point, we are left with only a limited number of sources, the Bible and the works of Herodotus, created approximately 2 centuries after his death. It is through these ancient texts that our indirect knowledge of the fate of the Assyrian king has survived, a figure whose name is inextricably linked to the decline of the great empire. For an ancient conqueror, Mesopotamia was a distant and mysterious land, shrouded in mystique and impenetrable by historical fog. Whether through dreams or imagination, this land seemed to him a place full of ancient secrets and powerful cities, heard only in legends. Yet one truth imparted a clear understanding: after the death of Shalmaneser V, the great Assyrian ruler, chaos erupted within the empire, like a storm destroying the order and serenity of past years. On the streets of many cities, fierce fighting broke out, rebellions engulfed the entire provincial part of the state. Babylon, once conquered by Assyria, again proclaimed its independence, and this act tore the empire apart into several warring factions, turning it into a tattered carcass. In the years following this event, roughly the 16th to 20th years of the 10th century BC, the so-called Babylonian chronicles begin, recounting the last, fateful era of the fall of Assyrian society. At the heart of this catastrophic collapse were those who, despite being enemies of the Assyrians, had long concealed their plans, hiding in the surrounding Median hills and mountain ranges. It was they, having patiently bided their time and waiting for the right moment, who suddenly launched a surprise attack, descending from the Gizaga and Zogras foothills to halt the impending death of the Assyrian Empire. Their army unexpectedly descended into Assyria's lands, directly towards the majestic ancient capital, the city of Ashur, founded as the spiritual and cultural center of the people, where the house of their god was kept and where their fate once unfolded. Contemporary analysts and chronicles recount that these events were an unparalleled shock to the entire world of that time. The city, with its formidable walls, was seized, blown up, and destroyed. Most of the population, caught in the brutal clashes, perished in a bloody massacre. The city's walls, once protecting its inhabitants, were torn down, and Ashur itself was looted, its valuables and riches handed over to the enemies. Prisoners taken during this plundering were led away into obscurity. This victory undoubtedly shook the entire ancient civilized world because, for the first time in many centuries, an Assyrian city at the heart of the empire was stormed, subjected to final devastation. News of this feat undoubtedly reached even the farthest corners of hostile territories, reminding everyone of the weakness of the Assyrians. In their core still lurked a strength that could be justified if only enough efforts were made. And it was at this troubling moment that one man heard this battle cry. He was merely a new king, the ruler of the independent Babylon, a man of great ideas and ambitions concerning the mighty city whose power he was about to restore. His name was Nabashar, a very interesting and mysterious individual. No clear data on his origins have survived, but in his inscriptions, he called himself Marlamana, meaning son of nothingness. No other king of Mesopotamia used such a self-designation, which indicated his special self-awareness and possibly a desire to emphasize his remarkable humility or even protest against arrogance. Nabashar could not foresee what lay ahead, but the gloomy news about the Medians' victory in Ashur and the destruction of the ancient capital had a profound emotional impact on him. He devoted many years to strengthening his state's borders, gathering strength for the inevitable confrontation with Syria, and now his dreams began to take on new, more grandiose contours. He assembled his troops and immediately marched to Ashur, intending to join forces with the Medes in a combined effort against the approaching threat. Unfortunately, the Babylonian army arrived at the ruined city's walls too late to participate in the battle itself, but on the ruins, they managed to forge an important alliance. The Media king, Kiarak, according to ancient customs, married the daughter of the Babylonian monarch Amytis, while he himself betrothed his daughter to Prince Nabuchodonosor. This cunning and calculated alliance became the foundation of the future war that, undoubtedly, would alter the fate of the entire region. This moment became what Assyria had long dreamed of, to ultimately unite the enemy's forces and destroy it. And finally, this dream could become reality. At its most vulnerable point, when internal resistance was completely weakened, Assyria found itself surrounded by united forces. In the year when the military actions began, 8 years earlier, the allied armies of the Medes and Babylonians advanced northward along the Euphrates River. But danger lurked even within their ranks, like a wounded lion remaining dangerous, vulnerable but unbroken. Despite their exhaustion, the Assyrian armies continued fighting and posed a threat to their enemies, making them pay with blood and effort for every captured location. Only 2 years after the invasion began, namely, in the 16th year before our era, the Median army reached the walls of the greatest city of Assyria, Nineveh. One can only imagine the feelings that overwhelmed them when, before their eyes, rose this magnificent city, the imperial center of the world, with its towering ziggurats, luxurious palaces, and massive double walls protecting its borders. The detailed accounts from Babylonian chronicles allow us to trace how events unfolded further. After the city of Kyaxar was destroyed, he crossed the river and headed upstream along the Tigris, where, by order of their command, a camp was set up directly opposite Nineveh. Several months had passed since the beginning of the siege, during which 3 large-scale battles took place. During this period, forces supporting Abu launched an organized and determined assault on the city, aiming to break its defenses. Archaeological excavations near the southeastern gates of Nineveh, known as the Halsey Gates, evidenced the brutality of the fighting. Numerous remains were found there, confirming tragic losses among both defenders and horses, skeletons scattered across the roadway, horse corpses, as well as weapons, arrows and spears, covered with layers of dirt and dust from centuries. Modern scholars suggest that these weapon remains were left in the city's last line of defense more than 2.5 centuries ago. Babylonian chronicles, which preserved memories of heroic and hopeless attempts of the defenders, depict a grim picture of the final days. According to the chronicles, during the month of Abu, the city was taken, and its entire population was annihilated without exception. On that terrible day, the Assyrian king, Sinsar-Ishkin, was forced to abandon these lands, leaving them in the hands of the enemies. The victors took with them rich plunder, ruined temples, valuable artisanal products, and a large number of prisoners. Among the ruins, which consisted of piles of garbage and mounds of broken brick, the traces of tragedy become evident. The Jewish sages of that time enthusiastically described this dramatic scene, and the most poetic testimonies are preserved in the Holy Scripture, in the Book of Nahum. There, one can hear the roar of battle, the clash of chariots, and the fury of the warriors fighting. Chariots racing through stony streets collided, creating a deafening noise, and soldiers dressed in bright red garments presented a formidable sight. Armored chariot troops, clad in shining steel armor, instilled fear in every enemy. On one such day of battle, the sky above the city was illuminated by fiery whirlwinds, captivating yet terrifying, for they represented the relentless power of the warrior god who declared, "I am against you, and your chariots will burn in smoke, and the sword will devour your youth like lions." I will destroy your spoil, and your voice will no longer be heard. Woe to you, bloody city, full of lies, filling yourself with the blood of the innocent. Riders rush to meet the enemy, swords and spears gleam, and corpses lie in heaps. Dead bodies are mixed with each other, stepping over them as if on a paved street strewn with the slain. All fortified places of the city, like fig trees, fall one after another if shaken. And then, like poison, ripe fruits drop away forever. For Nahum, the destruction of Nineveh was not only a physical downfall, it was also a moral sentence for an empire that brought suffering and death to the entire surrounding world. The Lord, a jealous and wrathful God, does not tolerate offenses and leaves unpunished those who dare to violate his righteousness. He avenges his chosen and keeps indignation in his heart against enemies. His commands are such, that your name be never mentioned again, for you have become insignificant and forgotten. The gates of your land are flung open to enemies, fire consumes the locks, ruthlessly burning everything that was once trustworthy. O, King of Assyria, your people are scattered over the mountains, and it is impossible to gather them together again. No remedy can be found for the deep wound, and the pain you carry is exhausting you from within. Your wound is so deep that all who hear of your fall rejoice and celebrate your defeat, because no one has forgotten your deeds and dishonors. By the end of the year 1612 BC, the three great capitals of the Assyrian Empire, Ashur as a religious center, Nineveh as its administrative heart, and Nimrud as a powerful military stronghold, lay in ruins, destroyed and desolate. The Medes did not seek to conquer Assyria, their military power and political will were focused on their own goals, not on invading other lands. As a result of this cruel turn of events, entire cities began to be destroyed, exhibiting the same ruthlessness and bloodthirstiness that once characterized the Assyrians in their conquests. The image of broken walls and burned buildings became familiar to those who endured this chaos. During the final battle for the cities, the Assyrian king Ashur-Balad exhibited extraordinary resilience and bravery. He led the remnants of the army, which had gathered over days and nights, and heroically resisted the enemies. However, most of the forces, which had recently arrived from Egypt, came too late to arrive in time to defend Nineveh, perhaps realizing that it was already too late and that the war was hopelessly lost. They then sought refuge in the city of Haran, which became their last sanctuary. Many of them were undoubtedly haunted by the thought that it was here, a century earlier, that a woman had prophesied the fall of the Assyrian Empire. In those distant times, in 600 BCE, about 2 years after the destruction of Nineveh, the Median armies finally reached Haran and shattered the remaining Assyrian resistance. At that time, the great general Ashur-Balad disappeared, who entered history along with the fate of the mighty Assyrian state, which vanished forever. The Babylonian king Nabal-Balar, overwhelmed with joy over his victory, left records in which he extolled the destruction of his terrible enemy. Assyrian conquests, carried out of hatred and divine wrath, subjected the lands of the land of Asha to suffering and affliction, imposing a heavy yoke upon them. I, a weak and powerless mistress compared to the mighty gods, so every thought directed toward higher powers might say, I, the mistress of the lords of Marduk, who by her sorcerous power hindered the enslavement of peoples, stood in the way of Assyrian tyranny and compelled the Babylonians to cast off the chains of their ancestral yoke. Gradually, over time, King Nabal-Balar placed more trust in his heir, his son, Prince Nabuchodonosor, known in the Bible as Nebuchadnezzar. His reign marked the beginning of a new dynasty of Babylonian kings who would shape their destiny, opening a new chapter in the region's history. But none of the great cities of Assyria would ever rise from the ruins again. The remains often bore traces of destruction. The ruins of Nineveh, once a powerful capital, would forever remain as smoking, black debris, and its streets as bloody wreckage of fallen citizens. Over time, the sands of the desert would begin to encroach upon these lands, engulfing the remnants of civilization. Walls and houses would vanish beneath layers of dust and earth, and the skeletons of the slain would be buried beneath the top layer of sand. The great library of King Ashurbanipal, one of the greatest treasure troves of ancient knowledge, would also be destroyed and abandoned. But, surprisingly, it was this very destruction and the act of witnessing the city turning into ruins that would preserve its priceless texts and manuscripts. The fires engulfing Nineveh did not allow these valuable scrolls to be completely consumed. The clay from which thousands of tablets were made was fired in the kiln and became hard, allowing the inscriptions to remain as clear as they were on the day they were created thousands of years ago by Assyrian scribes, as if time had stopped, sealing them forever.
The people who destroyed this great city marked their victory by celebrating and causing chaos in the palaces of Ashurbanipal, Ashurhaddon, and Sennacherib. They plundered the throne rooms, stealing jewelry and valuables, and desecrated the carved figures decorating the walls. The images of the Assyrian kings were especially damaged, soft alabaster was shattered and destroyed, and the smiles and expressions on their faces were defiled. All this brought joy to the looters, who reveled in their power. However, among the many damaged sculptures, there were those depicting scenes of lion hunts. Their faces, etched with fear and sorrow, probably looked with sad eyes at the abandoned halls once filled with life. These scenes symbolized the great power and authority of the Assyrian rulers, now only preserved in memory and stone. Time passed, and the once triumphant and lively rooms turned into deserted halls covered with ash and dust. The walls began to crumble, the beams of the roofs disintegrated, and plants started to grow in the cracked, overgrown ruins of the halls, filling the emptiness and reminding of past glory. Gradually, the royal palaces and streets of the city were completely swallowed by perpetual forgetfulness, disappearing beneath layers of sand and time, forever losing their former splendor and might. On these abandoned grounds, birds and wild forests found a new refuge, nestled among the ruins of ancient structures. They watched the rising blue-tinted tamarisk bushes, filling the numerous corridors and open spaces of the long-abandoned city, creating a truly mesmerizing scene. Centuries passed until the Greek historian Xenophon, crossing this area with 10,000 compatriots fleeing the Persian army's oppression, paid no attention to these ruins. By then, the inhabitants of the surrounding lands had long forgotten the people who had built this city. They only mentioned that it might have been founded by the Medes and that, for some reason, the gods punished them by turning the buildings and city into ruins. In the mid-19th century, Victorian archaeologist Austen Henry Laird visited the remaining ruins of Nineveh and made a remarkable observation. During his brief exploration, he stopped near the giant ruins located on the eastern bank of the river, which are believed to be the remnants of ancient Nineveh. From the top of an artificially constructed hill, he looked down and saw a vast plain crossed by winding river currents. On the eastern side, it was bounded by tall mounds, among which one stood out pyramid-shaped. It rose above the others, like a symbol of the grandeur of the ancient building mentioned by Xenophon. This mound resembled a pyramid surrounded by an encampment of 10,000 soldiers. All of this reminded him of the past, of the times when this area was the site of a mighty city, surrounded by armies and prepared for defense. The ruins he observed were precisely those seen by 20th-century Greek generals, traces of an era long gone. Even when these ruins were still relatively close to their zenith, they represented the remnants of the glorious past of a once great city. Laird was struck by the incredible, transparent, shining beauty of these ancient monuments. It seemed as if the ruins barely retained any traces of human presence. The stone and brick remains no longer reflected the life and activity that once filled these spaces. If a traveler, seeking ruins, crossed the Euphrates River to find similar places in Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, or Syria, his search would be unsuccessful. Everywhere he wandered, he would find only vanished columns rising above the bright greenery of myrtles, holly, and oleanders, and a death amphitheater with its granite steps ascending the slopes, surrounded by the dark blue surface of lakes. All this had disappeared, giving way to a stark, shapeless mound that rose like a hill amid a desolate plain. Where once magnificent buildings stood, there were shards of pottery and massive, layered vaults of brick walls, sometimes covered with the snow of winter rains. All that remained of the glorious past were isolated surviving artifacts, broken pieces of pottery, parts of lost structures. Like Xenophon more than 2,000 years ago, Laird was profoundly affected by this scene. These ruins bore silent witness to a deep rift in time that separated them from the present. The surrounding scene, a landscape of complete desolation, seemed like a mirror reflection of the chasm between the past and the present. Here, among these ancient ruins, silence reigned, and in its emptiness and stillness, it evoked both reverence and wonder. Just as there was no strength to comfort or fill the heart with hope, there was nothing here that could dispel this all-consuming sadness or tell stories of bygone days. These immense mounds, symbols of Assyrian power, left a stronger impression on me and prompted deeper reflection than all the magnificent temples of Baalbek and theaters of Ionia I had ever seen. Only through the painstaking labor of generations of scholars, slowly deciphering and translating their inscriptions from ancient tablets, was their content gradually uncovered. The voices of those ancient times, their voices recorded on clay tablets, sounded once more, breaking the silence of centuries past.
I was especially eager to end this account with one of those mysterious poems, created by an anonymous author in Akkadian and known as Lament for the City. This poem is not merely a literary work, but a window into the soul of a vanished civilization, a remembrance of the dead in their dreams, which still dwell within the mysterious lines of ancient texts. Although such mournful and touching compositions were popular during the early Sumerian period, their significance and prevalence greatly diminished with the rise of the Assyrian epic. In this poem, the voice of a goddess can be heard, recalling her homeland, destroyed and ravaged by war and conquest. Now she is forced to wander through endless, barren deserts, lamenting with each breath the void of memory concerning a place she once called home, her support, and her joy. The very text of the poem conveys its feelings and thoughts often intermittently and fragmentarily, with numerous pauses and gaps, creating an effect of fractured consciousness and spiritual loss. Yet it is precisely these stylistic devices that convey the deepest and most sincere emotions experienced by all the peoples within the Assyrian Empire during times when the shadow of grief overshadowed every heart, reminding them of loss and destruction. Imagine what it was like living in the heart of the majestic empire, knowing that its final days were near, and that the ruins could bear witness to its former grandeur. In this image, scenes seem to come alive. The empire, once seated on a throne of power and might, inflicting suffering upon numerous nations, which, united in the fight for justice, finally demand their freedom and recognition. Magnificent halls adorned with vivid murals and skillfully carved alabaster patterns, symbols of luxury and cultural wealth, fill the imagination with visions of regal splendor. Gardens full of rare trees and multicolored flowers seem to embody grace and prosperity, while spacious libraries filled with ancient books and relics of bygone eras tell of this people's rich history. All these are vivid symbols of refined culture and a high level of civilization, which can be lost in an instant under the force of destruction, leaving behind only shadows of past glory.